aftermath of the pandemic and with the recent increase in asylum seekers in New York City. The committee would like to know how we may be able to better support those in the existing system and how they are faring at securing safe, permanent, and stable housing without having to enter general DHS. We will also hear two pieces of preconsidered legislation, which I have sponsored: a bill to expand the current reporting requirements on exits from domestic violence shelters to include both domestic violence emergency shelter exits as well as domestic violence Tier 2 shelter exits, and a bill to amend the existing reporting requirements regarding multi-agency emergency housing assistance to include reporting on applications for domestic violence emergency shelters and applications for domestic violence Tier 2 shelters by household size. These bills, which come from recommendations in the New Destiny report, will help us to better understand the needs of survivors so that we can provide them with the most appropriate support. I look forward to hearing from the administration and advocates today and gather feedback on the oversight topic and legislation. I would like to recognize that we have Councilmember Ong on Zoom and have been joined by Councilmember Gutierrez. I would also like to thank the committee staff who worked hard to prepare this hearing: Aminta Kilawan, Senior Legislative Counsel; Sahar Mozami, Legislative Counsel; Nina Rosenberg, Policy Analyst; Julia Haramis, Unit Head; Elizabeth Childers Garcia, Finance Analyst; Andrew Sko, Data Analyst; and finally my staff, Elsie Encarnacion, Chief of Staff. I would now like to turn it over to Chair Lewis for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker Ayala. Good morning, everyone. My name is Farah Lewis. I'm the chair of the Committee on Women and Gender Equity. I'd like to begin by thanking my colleague, Deputy Speaker Diana Ayala, who is the chair of the Committee on General Welfare, for holding this very important hearing. I would also like to welcome everyone else who is joining us here this morning. We appreciate your time and participation. Today, we are here to explore how best to support domestic violence survivors in the New York City shelter system. As the Deputy Speaker stated in her opening remarks, domestic violence is among the most common reasons individuals enter the shelter system. A recent July 2024 report by the New Destiny Housing has taken a comprehensive look at the unique barriers and challenges faced by persons who flee dangerous situations in order to seek safety for themselves and their families. Access to safe housing is the cornerstone which allows survivors of domestic violence to begin their road to recovery. Part of the pathway to health and healing for survivors must include foundational support of long-term housing stability so people may access the supports and services they need to succeed. Safe housing is the key that allows people to begin to deal with the effects of trauma, economic hardship, and the physical and emotional aftermath of domestic violence. We know circumstances are different for every survivor, and there is no one-size-fits-all solution for those who seek help in the New York City shelter system. That said, these committees look forward to hearing from the administration, advocates, members of the public, and other interested stakeholders, including those who have lived experiences, who have taken the time to come here today to join us, and we thank you all for your time and advocacy. I would also like to thank my own staff, as well as those of the other committee who worked hard to prepare for this hearing. Finally, I'd like to thank the Women and Gender Equity Committee staff, Legislative Counsel Sahar Mozami, Legislative Counsel Rachel Conte, Senior Legislative Policy Analyst Christy Dreyer, Vida Yagnik, Finance Analyst, Rosa Martinez, Assistant Deputy Director of Data Operations Unit, as well as my Legislative Liaison Daniel Heredia, Blake Shaw, and my new legislative fellow, Michaela Belmir. I will now pass it to my colleague, Deputy Speaker Ayala. Thank you.
I would now like to turn it over to our committee counsel to swear in the members of the administration.
Will you please raise your right hand? Do you affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth before this committee, and to respond honestly to council member questions? Thank you. You may begin when ready.
Good morning, Deputy Speaker Ayala, Chair Lewis, and members of the Committee on General Welfare and the Committee on Women and Gender Equity. My name is John Rojas, and I serve as Chief Special Services Officer at the Human Resource Administration within the Department of Social Services. My portfolio, among other things, includes oversight of the city's domestic violence shelter system. I would like to thank the committees for the opportunity to testify today on the work to support survivors of domestic violence that are experiencing homelessness. I am joined by my colleagues, Rima Rivera, Deputy Commissioner of Domestic Violence Services at HRA, Akila Winston, Deputy Commissioner of Shelter and Intake Assessment, the Department of Homeless Services, and DHS, and Jennifer DeCarly, Deputy Commissioner for Family Justice Center Operations and Survivor Services at the Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence, ENDGBV. As you're aware, October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, giving us all the opportunity to lift up survivors, their loved ones, and survivor advocates in our shared community's efforts as we work to create the positive change we must continually pursue. We salute their work, and I welcome the opportunity to update the Council on our initiatives to support survivors of domestic violence in the domestic violence shelter system. I would like to begin by sharing information with anyone in the public who may need help. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic or gender-based violence, help is available. The New York City 24-hour domestic hotline is 1-800-621-HOPE. You can reach the Human Trafficking Resource Center at 1-888-373-7888. The New York City Gay and Lesbian Anti-Violence Project at 212-714-1141, and Barrier Free Living with a focus on assisting individuals with disabilities at 212-533-4358. We understand the importance of centering the client family needs, and strive to be a resource for linking survivors of domestic violence to culturally competent care during their time of need. We welcome the opportunity to share our work to ensure that survivors have access to safe living environment and trauma-informed services, both within the shelter system and as they safely transition to the community. HRA administers the largest domestic violence shelter system in the country. The emergency domestic violence shelter system consists of 54 confidential facilities through all 5 boroughs, comprised of 42 emergency shelters and 12 family transitional shelters, commonly referred to as Tier 2. There are 2,290 emergency domestic violence shelter beds, which serve both individuals and families. There are 628 family transitional shelter units open system-wide. The emergency beds provide trauma-informed shelter services to domestic violence survivors who are at immediate risk. Only domestic survivors who are stabilized in the emergency system can be transferred to Tier 2 shelters. In fiscal year 24, the HRA domestic violence system served 11,223 adults and children in emergency and family transition shelters. Shelters serve as an entryway to further services and assistance, including child care services, housing assistance, benefit entitlement assistance, financial development service, and economic empowerment programs. Shelters also serve as the entry point for expressive therapies, for example, art, play, and recreational, stress reduction skill techniques, mental and substance abuse counseling, and community-based medical providers. Having provided that overview, I will now share an overview of intake, the array of services and linkages to care shelters provide, and the pathway to greater independence for safe move-out. There are 3 pathways to intake. One pathway is through the Safe Horizon Hotline. Survivors can connect with advocates to receive services, counseling, and information about available resources to maintain their and their family's safety. Support can include crisis counseling, safety planning, information and resources, and assistance finding domestic violence shelters. A second pathway is through the No Violence Again, or NOVA screening, at DHS's Prevention, Assistance, and Temporary Housing PATH Intake Center, or at the Adult Family Intake Center, AFIC, or at a single intake center. A third pathway to intake is through community-based referral that can be local precincts, neighborhood hospitals, family justice centers, or DV non-residential community providers or other social service providers. DV emergency shelter providers are required to provide several essential services. They provide hotline services, which include crisis intervention counseling and information and referrals, including referrals to other available residential programs when the facility is at capacity. They also provide safe and secure housing. Shelters are required to offer housing with appropriate security measures, including safety locks and 24-hour security. Housing must be clean and provide basic amenities. They also provide support services, including case management services, counseling, support groups, advocacy, and assistance obtaining social services. Shelters also provide child care and education. Services should include arrangement for child care, offering age-appropriate recreational and social activities on a daily basis during regular business hours for children residing in the facility, the provision of appropriate counseling services to children residing in the facility, and educational support for children of survivors. Medical services, meaning providers establish linkages with accredited medical institutions or clinics with qualified medical personnel, physicians, for example, physicians or nurse practitioners, for health examination, follow-up visits, and mental health services. They also provide transportation, meaning to the extent possible, arranging for transportation to the facility in an emergency and making transportation available for residents in order for the residents to secure legal, medical, housing, employment, or public assistance services, or assist residents to obtain available public or private transportation when possible. And lastly, they provide referrals to other social service supports. This may be legal services on-site or in the community, education, and outreach activity. The New York State Office of Temporary Disability Assistance regulations mandate that within 10 days of admission to a shelter, the provider and adult members of the resident family must develop an independent living plan, or an ILP. ILPs must be reviewed with the family at least once every 2 weeks and revised as necessary to assist the family in obtaining permanent housing. We are cognizant of the fact that in the sphere of human services, and particularly with respect to individuals and families surviving domestic violence, one size does not fit all. The services offered including housing and benefits assistance, financial development, economic empowerment programs, mental health, and substance abuse counseling and childcare, whether provided on-site or through partnerships, are a key element in a pathway towards greater independence and move-out. New York State imposes limits on emergency DV shelters. Survivors have 90 days, then a potential for a 45-day extension, and then a potential for a final additional 45-day extension, meaning a New York City imposed maximum of 180 days in an emergency DV shelter. The 1.4% vacancy rate, coupled with the 180-day maximum emergency DV shelter limit, means that we do have exits from DV emergency shelter to DHS shelter. We are continually working to ensure that the transition is seamless as possible. That means bolstering our system to allow for more warm handoffs and establishing back office links so a housing shopper letter does not fall away in the transition from a DV emergency shelter to a DHS shelter. I can report that in 2025, we plan to make every effort to even further progress in strengthening the HRA-DHS links to provide even more robust support services to survivors making that transition. We operate under a regulatory framework that includes New York, state, and federal laws that seek to uphold the safety, privacy, and standards of service of our clients. The New York State Domestic Violence Prevention Act of 1987 requires counties to provide shelter and services to survivors of domestic violence. Further, it establishes that funding for these programs. The New York State Office of Children and Family Services, OCFS, promulgates regulations for licensure and the standards for establishment and maintenance of residential and non-residential domestic violence programs. The New York State Office of Temporary Disability and Temporary and Disability Assistance, OTDA, authorizes DSSHRA to administer the financial and contractual requirements of the domestic violence Tier 2 system. In addition, federal law also provides parameters for our operations of the shelters, program, and services we administer, including the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act, the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, and the Victims' Crime Act, VOCA. We keep these regulatory framework in mind in service delivery and in examining legislative proposals. Turning to the legislation under consideration at today's hearing, file number 2572 is an amendment to existing law 83 of 2018, where DSS reports annually on exits from domestic violence emergency shelters. File number 2572 would expand the current reporting requirements from exits from domestic violence shelters to include both domestic violence emergency shelter exits as well as domestic violence Tier 2 shelter exits. This report would also be required monthly. File number 2573 is a further amendment to Local Law 79 of 2022, which was previously modified pursuant to Local Law 103 of 2023. File number 2573 would amend the existing reporting requirements regarding multi-agency emergency housing assistance to include reporting on applications for domestic violence emergency shelters and applications for domestic violence Tier 2 shelters by household size. All reporting legislation, including legislation that amends existing local law mandated reports, require careful consideration to assess for both the feasibility and the capacity to produce the report in a timely, accurate manner. What may appear at a surface level as a minor alteration to capture more information in pre-existing reports may ultimately require significant adjustment to workflows, for a household, single individual in a room intended to be for double occupancy, where single occupancy room is not available. In the previous state legislative session, the bill passed with both houses and is pending approval by the governor. We strongly encourage signing of this bill into law. In New York City, this legislation would increase the city's capacity to house single adult survivors of domestic violence. I will conclude by expressing gratitude to our staff, our providers, and the stakeholders, including survivors, survivor advocates, and residents of our communities who are working to keep a keen focus on domestic violence and further steps we can take to keep our fellow New Yorkers safe. As I said earlier, one size does not fit all. We are continually learning and taking on board the insights you as council, the community of stakeholders, and public hearings like this offer. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I want to acknowledge that we've also been joined by council members Riley and Banks. We have a packed house. Sorry about that. We have a competing hearing next door, and it's pretty packed over there as well, so we'll try to find you a seat. All right. Good morning, and thank you all for being here to testify. I'll start my questions with the vacancy rates at DV shelters. Can you tell us what the current vacancy rate for each HRA DV emergency shelter and HRA's DV Tier 2 shelters is?
Good morning. So happy to be here, able to speak today and answer any questions you may have. So your question was the vacancy rate? The vacancy rate for our emergency shelters is 12.7%, and the vacancy rate for our Tier 2 shelters is 7.6%.
Now, would you consider those to be relatively lower than usual, or is it
Usually it's within the, right, it's
within the range?
Yeah,
Okay.
it hasn't really decreased or.
All right. And in the MMR, HRA stated that they have a capacity of 2,290 for domestic violence emergency beds and a capacity of 593 for domestic violence Tier 2 units. Does HRA feel that the current DV shelter system has enough capacity to fully meet the level of demand?
Actually, now it's 628 Tier 2 units. We recently added 105 units. So there were 96 units that came on board at the end of December 2023, and an additional 9 ADA units that came on board in March of 2024. Currently, our portfolio serves all, in regards to your question regarding capacity, our portfolio serves all family compositions, and really it's based on the availability of occupancy. There may be a unit that is available, but it doesn't meet the needs of the client who is searching for accommodations at the time. It's a very complicated search for a survivor in the sense that they have to find accommodations that are safe for them in a safe area, and that meets the needs of their family composition. Also, something to consider is that unlike DHS, DV shelters, most of DV shelters are configured in a way where it's shared living. Mm-hmm. So it could be that families seeking shelter in the DV system may not be accepting of that shared living experience.
By shared living, you mean the same room, or are they sharing the bathroom?
They share the living area, like a bathroom, a living area, and each family has their own
common spaces,
separate accommodation. Mm-hmm.
But they don't share the same sleeping quarters.
No, they don't.
Okay. So I mean, but I guess the question is really: do you feel that there is adequate capacity to fully meet the needs of?
We are always reviewing our portfolio and assessing need, and we will speak to our Office of Budget Administration and OMB if there's a need to increase capacity.
Okay. Does that happen often?
Actually, Deputy Speaker Ayala, we're actually in the midst of planning for the release of an RFP for additional emergency shelter beds. So we hope by the end of the year to be able to release an RFP seeking an additional 94 beds. And this RFP seeks to target single adult households of one, and with a special emphasis on LGBTQI survivors. The facilities can't exclusively serve single adults. We've consulted with our oversight agency at the state, OCFS, and the facilities must always accept families if that's a requirement of the shelter system. But there is an emphasis on single adults and a special focus on LGBTQI survivors. So we hope and intend to expand with the issuance of this RFP later this year.
And is that RFP informed by specific need that is occurring now?
So we are replacing beds that we had lost, but we are converting them with a focus for the single adults.
Gotcha.
Given the input we received from our providers and the community.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, that's fair. Can you tell us what has been the average length of stay for clients in each DV shelter, emergency shelter and DV Tier 2 shelter prior to the pandemic and since the onset of the pandemic, and in fiscal year 2024 to date?
Sure. So it seems as if the clients that we served during the past 6 years, before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and post-pandemic, has remained relatively the same. There hasn't been much fluctuation. There was a little decrease during 2020, during the onset of the pandemic. But if you just give me a second, I can just find.
Could you bring the mic down a little bit?
Sure.
Thanks.
So if you give me a second, I can actually look for those numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you. So in 2019, we served 11,123 individuals in both our emergency and Tier 2 systems. In 2020, it dipped a little down to 9,439.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that number?
Oh,
The second number.
in 2020, 9,439. In 2021, 10,201. In 2022, 10,640. And in 2023, 10,842. So it seems as if we're increasing incrementally.
Okay. So 2019 was 11,123?
2019 was 11,123.
All right. Okay. So slight increases.
It's
not, yeah. Okay. All right. Can you tell us what is the current average cost per night for DV emergency shelters?
So,
So for the emergency shelters, the average per diem is $123 per person per night. For our Tier 2 shelters, it's $193 per night per unit. So there might be multiple individuals in a Tier 2, but they get the standard rate of $193, versus at an emergency shelter, they get paid by person. So if there's more than one person, they'll get that $123 per person.
Oh, okay.
So it varies between the Tier 2 and the emergency shelter system.
And the tier 2 is per unit?
Correct.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Can you tell us what percentage of clients existing in HRA's DV emergency shelters are placed in DV tier 2 shelters?
Can you repeat those last
Yeah.
part?
Oh, sorry. What percentage of clients exiting HRA's DV emergency shelters are placed in DV tier 2 shelters?
26%. 26%.
And for those that don't end up in a tier 2 shelter, how many are placed in DHS shelters?
That would be 22%. This was
And-
fiscal year '24.
All right. And how many are placed in permanent housing?
From our emergency shelter, 9%, and from our Tier 2 shelter, where a client has the ability to spend more time searching, it's 39%.
Okay. What are the other top places that clients exit to?
So 24% have left on their own. This is from emergency shelters. 8% have moved in with relatives. 5%, 5% have transferred from one emergency shelter to another. Sometimes there's a need for emergency transfer from one shelter to another. 4% secured an apartment on their own. And 2% returned to a former apartment without a batterer. 2% left New York City. 2% obtained permanent housing using a FEPS-B voucher. 1% city FEPS. 1% Section 8 HPD. 1% Section 8 NYCHA. 1% return to a batterer, and we have a 1% none of the above. From our Tier 2 exits, our tier exit data tells us that there were 23% that the provider indicated none of the above. 18% left Tier 2 to go to PATH DHS. 12% left on their own. 11% used FEPS-B voucher to find permanent housing. 8% city FEPS voucher. 8% Section 8 NYCHA. 8% apartment secured on own. 4% Section 8 HPD. 4% moved in with relatives. And then there was a 4% that transferred from one Tier 2 to another.
Perfect, thank you.
You're welcome.
According to the mayor's management report, they state that the percent of eligible families seeking shelter at prevention assistance and temporary housing PATH who entered HRA's domestic violence shelters has decreased by 9% from 23% in fiscal year 2023 to 14.1% in fiscal year 2024. This continues a downward trend reported since fiscal year 2021. Can HRA explain why the percentage of eligible families continues to decrease, even though we know that overall rates of domestic violence in the city remain constant?
I'm sorry, Speaker, Deputy Speaker, can you repeat that question?
Yeah. Can HRA explain why the percentage of eligible families continues to decrease, even though we know that the overall rates of DV in the city remain constant?
The number of eligible families that are placed in our DV system is
From Pat.
from PATH.
You want me to read the question?
Sure, so you're asking.
So the mayor's management report states that the percent of eligible families seeking shelter at PATH who
yes.
entered HRA's domestic violence shelters has decreased by 9%, from 23% in fiscal year 2023
Okay.
to 14.1% in fiscal year 2024.
So these are clients that are referred to our NOVA team at PATH intake. These DHS applicants are referred to our team when they disclose that there's been a history of DV or they've experienced DV. They are screened at DHS by social workers in their resource room and referred to NOVA for an additional screening. Many of these clients are not, they didn't self-refer, or they're not, the DHS made the referral. So it could be that many are not actually searching for shelter. They're being screened because they disclosed that there was a DV incident. So although a client or a DHS applicant may actually be eligible for DV shelter, it could be that they are not amenable to transfer from the DHS system into the DV shelter system. So again, our ability to link a client to DV shelter can be challenging because of the variables that I mentioned before. Is there accommodations at the time that can meet their needs? Can they be safely placed in an area that is safe for them? Can it meet their family configuration? Can it meet their immediate needs? So.
Okay, all right. I'm moving on to city FEPs. So can the Family Justice Centers process referrals for city FEPs, either to stay or to leave through home base?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Can you hear me? Sorry. It's great to be here with all of you, Deputy Speaker Ayala, Chair Lewis, other council members. So at the Family Justice Centers, we are able to support folks with linking to home-based offices for FEPS-B applications. We don't process city FEPS applications on site.
You don't process, okay.
No.
If not, what is the process to apply? Do survivors have to go in person to apply at our HRA office?
You mean to apply for FEPS-B applications?
Yes.
For FEPS-B. So for FEPS-B, we are able to link with survivors remotely or in person through our community partner network. And we're not actually doing the application at the FJC. We're just certifying that someone is eligible and then linking them to the appropriate home-based office. And we can do that for somebody who comes in person, like I said, or remotely through our partner network.
Okay. That makes sense, okay. The administration expanded eligibility for New York City 1515 supportive housing to include survivors with children this summer, which I'm really excited about. How many survivors with children? I know this is fairly recent, but do we know what the number of survivors with children that have been granted supportive housing since the expansion?
So the administration, along with the council, is very happy that our existing 1515 supportive housing was expanded. We expanded that in early summer, and on July 30th, we released an addenda to our 1515 RFPs for both scattered site and congregate to expand the supportive housing portfolio. So given that it was on July 30th, we're still waiting for proposals to come in so we could score them and award them, but we're hoping, and we do know some of our collaborators, our DV providers will probably be applying. So as of yet, we don't have any specifically for, based on the new revised domestic violence criteria that's been included. However, I do want to highlight that individuals and families who are survivors of domestic violence can be found eligible for the existing portfolio of supportive housing, including 1515, the various New York 3, including the state program, ESHI, Empire State Supportive Housing Initiative, which includes targeted units for domestic violence survivors. And I think, Rima, you could speak a bit to that, but we have made many placements to ESHI providers who have supportive housing specifically for domestic violence survivors, both primarily families.
Were single domestic violence survivors also included as an eligible population for the program?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Were singles considered an eligible population for the expansion of the program?
For the expansion for under 1515 was expanded with the families with children category only.
No singles?
No.
Okay. Do we know how many congregate and scatter site units for families with children remain unawarded?
Approximately 700.
Has the administration considered reallocating unawarded scatter site units to congregate?
Those conversations are occurring. It's a larger conversation with our other providers and stakeholders.
We've been joined by Councilmember Althea Stevens. Good morning, Councilmember. Hold on, okay, here we go. I have 2 more questions and I'm gonna transfer it over. The administration sees to streamline survivors from HRA domestic violence to DHS shelters in 2022. Currently, survivors with children who are not eligible to be finding a home or transfer to an HRA domestic violence Tier 2 shelter must apply for shelter at DHS's intake center in the Bronx without a guaranteed placement and with a risk of being turned away. Is the administration planning to reinstate the streamlining policy? And if so, what is the timeline and what is the criteria?
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Great question. Yes, we are. So currently, streamlining activities were paused, and clients who transition from DV shelter to DHS, we work with DHS on a warm handoff. We provide them with a referral letter with information so that the client can be safely placed at DHS shelter. And I also want to go back to, because you asked a question earlier about clients who were referred to our NOVA team at PATH. If they're not placed in DV shelter or they refuse placement or transition to a DV shelter system is not amenable to them, we do enter information into the DHS care system as to how to safely place information that can help them safely place this client in the DHS system. We give them areas that have been identified as a safe area for the client, and also information on the person who's caused harm. So I just want to make sure that that's noted.
I appreciate that. Can you tell us, are there any cost implications related to resuming streamlining?
In the sense that there isn't.
No. Would there be any revisions to the previous process?
We are working with our colleagues at DHS to enhance the process, including reporting on clients that transition from DHS, from DV to DHS through this process.
Okay. All right. I will now transfer it over to Councilmember Lewis for questions.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and good morning again. I want to briefly discuss HPD homeless set-asides. We know that survivors in HRA DV shelter cannot access these units. The mayor stated that the administration will reverse this administrative decision and open up units to families and individuals in the 5 shelter systems. So I wanted to know if you all can share with us, has the change gone into effect, and if not, when do you anticipate that would happen?
Sure, so I can let you know as to our progress. So we are currently in the first phase of providing access to families in DV shelter to HPD set-asides. And the first phase really consists of beginning the application process. And should the family transition from DV to DHS, that application could be completed once that client enters DHS. The second phase will be the ability for DVS, and our providers to submit applications directly to HPD.
When does the second phase start?
Right now, we're getting through the first phase.
Okay.
But we will let you know.
Do you have an anticipated time when the first phase will end?
Right now, we are negotiating some technical difficulties, ensuring that whatever information we enter into the system is safely transferred to HPD, because of course we want to maintain client confidentiality. So we hope that we'll be able to complete the first phase. I think it's not going to be completed by the end of this calendar year, but I'm hoping by early 2025.
Oh, fiscal year 26.
Yes.
Got it. How many survivors in the DHS shelter system were able to move to an apartment set aside for New Yorkers in the shelter in FY24?
Good morning, and thank you for your question and for the ability to be here and provide information on the services that we provide. So while we do not specifically track HPD set-aside, specifically track data for HPD set-asides, I can report that for our entire NOVA population, there were 870 placements. That includes both subsidized and unsubsidized for fiscal year 24.
When can we get the stats for the other sites?
I can follow up to get that information to you.
If you could send that to the committee council, we'd
Sure.
appreciate it. Thank you. In 2022, New York City took a major step in homelessness prevention by creating a housing stability program for domestic violence survivors, also known as microgrants. That's the elephant in the room. The program, managed by NGBV, provides low barrier grants to survivors and connects them to the supportive services with the goal of helping them maintain housing. Last year, the Adams administration allocated $1.2 million to establish a housing stability program for survivors of domestic violence and gender-based violence. The City Council and advocates called on the administration to increase and baseline funding for the program and to include an additional $4.8 million for FY25. Can you share with the public today the eligibility criteria and the application process for ENDGBV's microgrant program?
So thank you, Chair Lewis, for that question. And we're really excited to officially launch that program in July of this year, July 1st, 2024. We've been working really hard with our contracted providers to establish a very low barrier eligible for applications for the program. And so we are meeting with them regularly, and we're in the midst of kind of getting a uniform application that we'd be happy to share with the council. I know there's a report due by the end of the year to the council on the program, and we'd be happy to share that uniform application by then.
Okay. How many survivors have applied for the microgrant program
So
this
we
calendar
are
year?
collecting the data quarterly, and we are meeting with the providers and collecting that data right now. So again, we'll be happy
Wait,
to
say
share.
that one more time, sorry.
Sorry, I'm talking really quickly. We're meeting with the providers regularly, and we are getting quarterly data. So our first quarterly report will be due like right about now, and we'll be getting a report to the council by the end of the year.
Okay. What is the average microgrant amount requested this calendar year for FY25?
So we don't have the number right now because we're collecting the data, but we're anticipating it will be what it was before when we launched the COVID emergency program, where it was approximately $1,200 per survivor, and that's the average we're expecting again, but we haven't put a cap on requests.
How long does it take for survivors to receive the microgrant from the moment they apply?
So the goal of the program is to be as expeditious as possible with processing the applications. And so we are encouraging our providers to get that grant out quickly. And again, we'll be able to report that actual timeline by the end of the year to the council.
If you had to give like an example of a timeline, what would that look like?
So right now, the requests coming in are often for rent arrears, because the goal of the program, right, is to keep people stably housed, either in their existing housing or to help them move or relocate. So I know, for example, from a client we've worked with at the Family Justice Center recently, they applied to the program for relocation support, and they were able to get that grant turned around within a week. I think it really depends on the situation and the request by the client.
So possibly a week or so.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think it's going to be depend on the request, but we're encouraging as expeditiously as possible.
Thank you for that. Currently, how many clients are enrolled in this program, and how does that compare to historical enrollment levels over the past several years?
So again, I wish I had more numbers to share, but since we just officially launched it in July, we are collecting that data and will have that report to you. We are hoping that it's comparable. In our emergency program, we were able to get grants out to 377 survivors. That was a program that we stood up really quickly during COVID. The average grant amount was $1,243, and we dispersed almost $470,000 in a few months.
All right. If funding was not limited and the agency was able to support the full level of demand for the micro grant, how much would it cost and how many clients would it serve?
That's a really big question. I think that's what we're hoping to figure out with this program. We are really looking forward to continuing these conversations. We're thrilled to have this program.
Okay.
And because it just launched in July, we just don't have those answers just yet, but we hope to.
I think my frustration, and it's not you,
No,
just
I
in general,
understand.
we had a hearing earlier this year asking the same questions, and the frustration is that we don't have that information in advance. So it would be great if we could work with the agency to make sure that every time we come to a hearing, we have like some information to give. But I understand that you're still in the process.
Well, I can share if it's helpful, but it's not, the reason I haven't shared it yet, it's not going exactly to your question. The microgrants were, as you know, added on to our existing Home Plus programs,
Right.
and they provide 3 services: the lock change services, the personal alarm system services, and the microgrant services. And they were able to get me the personal alarm numbers for this year. So for FY24, we served 1,417 clients with personal alarm systems. They call them PERS. And in FY25, so since July 1 of 2024, we've served 691 clients with personal alarm systems. So I apologize that we don't have the other numbers, but we are at least able to share that. And that's because the flexible funding part just got added on July 1st, so we're still kind of getting that initial quarter of numbers.
All right, I'm going to get back to you on the alarms because I see the difference in the amounts per fiscal year. I'm going to shift a little bit to family justice centers.
Sure.
Earlier, you all shared with Deputy Speaker about home base and the FEPS access at family justice centers. So I wanted to know what other housing resources are provided to domestic violence survivors at family justice centers.
Thank you. That's a great question. We spend a tremendous amount of time working with our community of providers to provide as many housing options as possible to survivors. As you mentioned, we have the FEPS-B program, but that's only available for survivors with children who are on public assistance and have children under the age of 18. We also work really closely with New Destiny and our community of rapid rehousing providers. We have a HUD-funded DV planning grant. That is the goal of that grant is to incorporate the needs of DV survivors into the city's coordinated entry system. And to do that, we've greatly expanded our rapid rehousing programs. And so we're able to support survivors in applying for those programs. I wish they were as rapid as the name makes it sound, but we like to say they're rapid for New York City. It's a lot of support applying for different vouchers that might be available, as well as getting emergency financial assistance for 2 years through these programs. We've grown those programs from very small numbers to almost 10 programs in the city now. So that's been a huge part of our work through this HUD coordinated entry grant. And then we also work with our partners at NYCHA and HPD to support voucher programs. I know we've spoken here before about the emergency housing voucher program. We did that and we stood it up really quickly with city partners. We were thrilled to get vouchers allocated for survivors not in shelter, so to avoid shelter, which is obviously what we want to do as much as possible and keep people safe. And we were able to actually lease up over 1,200 survivors with those emergency housing vouchers. So that program just came to an end, and we hope to build on that success and have more targeted vouchers for survivors.
Thank you for that. How many HRA liaisons are available at FJCs?
So right now we have an HRA liaison that cycles around the 5 centers.
How many liaisons?
We have 1 HRA liaison that covers 1 day a week at each of our FJCs. But I would say we actually are able to, she's really our access point person, but then she liaisons with colleagues at our BACs, the job centers. They used to be called job centers, I now know they're BACs, and other colleagues so that we can network and leverage and have troubleshooting happen.
This is
And if I may, I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
it's also great to emphasize that HRA also oversees non-residential services, which are community providers that provide services to survivors who aren't in shelter but in the community. And they rotate into family justice centers, and they serve time there, addressing the needs of any domestic violence survivor in the community who comes to the Family Justice Center looking for help.
But you have one liaison?
No, we have one liaison that is currently at the FJC, but we also have a presence of DV non-residential providers that rotate and spend time in the various FJCs throughout the 5 boroughs. And we also have liaisons at the back centers. So we have domestic violence liaisons in every back center, benefit access center, that provides counseling and assists with temporary waivers for domestic violence clients who need an exemption or waiver from PA requirements, and information and referrals to community-based assistance. So we do have a presence in the back centers, and our non-residential providers have a presence at the FJCs.
I wonder how long does it take for that liaison to process the waivers?
So the liaison at the FJC doesn't process waivers.
Okay.
We have social workers at benefit access centers that process waivers for clients who need an exemption or a waiver from meeting the requirements for PA, because doing so might put them at risk.
Okay.
Actually, I have the number of DVL waivers that were processed and
Thank you.
that I'd like to give, if I can find it. I think it's in the...
While you look for that information, I just have a quick question regarding family justice centers and housing, as you shared earlier. I wanted to know, what does the check-in look like for clients once they're processed and they get into housing? Does your agency check in with them to make sure that they're stable and they're able to continue to remain in place?
Yes, that's a great question. So when you come into a family justice center and are screened for support and services, you're assigned to a case manager from one of our either city contracted or community network of partners. That case manager holds your case and helps you with the housing application process, and then continues to follow up with you afterwards to make sure you're stably housed. So we really, so for example, if Safe Horizon has case managers, they're holding those clients and providing that support. Same with Arab American Family Support Center. It depends on the actual CBO providing that support, but the goal is to do that and to ensure that they're safe and stably housed.
Okay, did you find that stat? Okay.
Yes, I did. So in calendar year 2023, we saw 9,368 clients, and we processed 6,643 waivers. So, and also just to clarify, we contract with 9 non-for-profit social service providers to provide domestic violence services to persons in the community. That's what when I was referring to our non-res providers. We contract with 9 providers, and they provide core services such as advocacy, counseling, information and referral, and they sit at the Family Justice Center.
And the stat you just gave us was for FY23?
The statistic I gave you was for calendar year 2023.
Okay. Last question on Local Law 45. Earlier this year, Council passed Local Law 45 of 2024, establishing a program to assist with door and window repair and security for survivors of domestic violence and gender-based violence. And we know that these types of services can help keep survivors in their homes and avoid entering the shelter system for lack of safe housing. How many individuals have benefited from this program within the calendar year? I know you've mentioned a number earlier, but if you could restate that. And can you confirm that door and window repair services have been, how many have been provided with that?
So it's a great question, and it's such an important service. So window and lock changes are part of the cadre of services you can get through Home Plus, which was codified by 45. So the number I gave you previously was for the personal emergency response systems.
That's the 1,417?
Yep, the 1,417 for FY24. and then 691 thus far for FY25.
Okay.
Those are the alarm systems. And the lock changes numbers we're hoping to have to you, and I know I'm sorry because I know that's going to frustrate you, but that's part of the data we're collecting from the providers. Those lock changes are up and going with the Home Plus providers, and they're able to provide those to clients.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to kick it back to Deputy Speaker Ayala. Thank you.
Are there any, Councilmember Aviles has joined us. Councilmember Gutierrez, you have questions?
Thank you, chairs. I have them written down here. Okay. And I don't know if you've covered this already, but if you did, I apologize. Can you provide information, can you provide information on the average wait time for families seeking emergency shelter? I can't hear you, I'm sorry. Oh, your mic is off.
Oh, that'll help. I'm sorry, Councilmember Gutierrez. Your question was the amount of time it takes for a...
To be placed into an emergency shelter.
It really depends on whether the person is able to find accommodations at the time that they're linked to shelter. So as mentioned before, there are 3 avenues available, 3 avenues to access DV shelter. If they call the hotline and they are linked to a provider, and again, I need to stress that HRA has no influence over whether clients are placed or not placed in DV shelter. This is a discussion that a domestic violence survivor has directly with the provider to see if the accommodations are suitable for them. And so it depends really on whether they can find the right accommodations at the time they're linked.
And specific accommodations, what are some of those accommodations that you can make for someone? Like, what is the range of whether they have children, or like what are some of those accommodations that folks ask for?
So it's dependent on their family configuration, whether the rooms they have available meet their needs. And again, I want to stress that it's shared living. So when they have that conversation with the provider, they're told that this is a situation where you're going to be sharing a unit with another family.
And every emergency shelter is this way?
Emergency shelters, yes, most emergency shelters. And family configuration, and of course, whether it's a safe placement for them. So they're limited based on what area is safe for them. I mean, depending on whether the person who caused harm lives in a certain area, whether that person who caused harm has family members who may live in another borough or another neighborhood that might cause harm, or might let them know that where their location is. So it's a nuanced process, and it could be quite challenging for a survivor to find appropriate housing. And the last thing that we want, of course, is to have a survivor enter a DV emergency shelter and have to leave because they feel as if this is an unsafe accommodation, or an accommodation that doesn't meet their needs.
Are there ever instances where considerations are made regarding a child's school district or, existing child care provider?
So the McKinney Rental Act, the parent is able to either decide to keep their child at the school that their originated school, or transfer that school to where the shelter is, nearer to where the shelter is. If they need busing services will be arranged for them. They also have, if they wish, they can let the DOE know that of their situation, of their DV situation, so that a separate line of communication could be had between DOE and the client. So they either have the ability to keep their child at the school they're in, or transfer that child to a closer school nearer the shelter.
Thank you. And then from HRA's perspective, how is the agency able to ensure that the CBO is providing these services have enough funding, have all the support? How often is that review, that check-in? I know Deputy Speaker Ayala in one of her initial questions asked, that it's the amount of folks needing assistance and housing is pretty stable despite how they're entering the city system and how you're monitoring. But what can you share about ensuring that?
Sure. I would say that's a joint process because although the administration contracts the provider, the actual oversight of both the Tier 2 and the emergency shelters are by state agencies. So OTDA oversees our Tier 2s and OCFS oversees our emergency shelters. So we work collaboratively with OTDA and OCFS respectively, but ultimately oversight is from these two state agencies. So everything from monitoring the services to incidents. So if an incident occurs, we may be made aware, but the official process to report an incident has to go through the state process. So it's a joint collaboration, I would say. But ultimately, our state partners are the ones who have the oversight, the license, including the licensure. So to your question, we want to make sure that the rooms are safe, habitable, and meet standards and requirements for shelter. And those licensures and those certifications are provided by the state, by each respective agency.
But I do want to add that we work.
We have time.
We work closely with OCFS and our providers. We kind of act as a bridge between providers and OCFS, and we meet regularly with our providers to make sure that they understand the regulations. Are there any barriers to service? Clarify any regulations that they may have questions on. So although the state does have oversight and they're responsible for compliance, we work very closely with OCFS and the providers to make sure that services are provided in an efficient manner.
Thank you. I do have more questions, but I can wait. Okay, sorry, I have a couple more questions. Thank you, chairs. My next question is related to clients with disabilities. And so this is, you can give me all the information, I'm brand new to this, but does the administration have any plan to increase accessibility of DV survivors or of domestic violence shelters for clients with disabilities, or what does that look like now?
So I do have information on the number of ADA units and rooms that we have available. If you could just bear with me.
Yeah, no, of course, thank you. And then while you're looking for that, I'll squeeze in another question, which is if a client has a disability or a need that can't be met at a shelter, what happens? And is there a process that you all have for accommodating that client?
Sure, thank you. It's a good question. So currently we have 106 ADA compliant beds, which is 5% of our emergency shelter portfolio.
And is that distributed borough to
So
borough?
we have
or?
one shelter in particular that provides assistance to those who are disabled.
Okay. And is there an intention to expand, or do you find that there is a growing need?
We would always look to, if we ever, as we mentioned earlier, we are preparing or planning to release a solicitation to replace 94 beds, and we will be giving more consideration to
The LGBT
for facilities that are able to provide ADA compliant rooms and beds.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Anyone else have questions? Councilmember Aviles?
Thank you so much, Chair. I was curious about the number of beds you have that are culturally competent for Muslim women and children. There's a real need, and I represent District 38, which includes Sunset Park, but between Sunset Park and Bay Ridge, a real dearth of beds available for DV survivors from Muslim families. Do you have, how many culturally competent?
Our shelters are available, residential services, residential shelters are available to all. So when someone seeks shelter, state regs prevents a provider to discriminate based on race or ethnicity, so or religion. So each shelter is open to all.
I guess a better way maybe to ask is, I obviously know you don't discriminate, but do you have shelter providers that are culturally competent, right? And that means, do they have accessibility to prayer spaces? Is the food halal? Are there other elements that would be necessary for, obviously, or would be dignified for a Muslim family that needs shelter in that circumstance?
We definitely recognize the need to ensure that our providers provide services in a way that's culturally sensitive and competent. So the state, and we encourage it as well, ensures actually that there are certain trainings that are provided to provider staff to ensure that services are delivered in a culturally sensitive way, and they are to provide these training plans to the state.
Do you have any data around this population in particular that you've been tracking or following? Because what I understand is there are no beds, and folks in community, like many communities, right, are struggling to support, their community members, but with all the complications of being in the same place where the violence is occurring and all those other complications. So I'd love to know how the city is approaching this particular need. Are there specific providers? Are we meeting the demands? Are you seeing the demands?
So it's a great question, Council Member. At the Family Justice Centers, we have a really strong partnership with two organizations in particular that work with our Arabic-speaking survivors, Arab American Family Support Center and Pillars of Peace. And they too, we have a number of culturally specific orgs working on site at the FJCs. They too have raised these concerns to us. And as Rima shared, we're constantly doing culturally specific and culturally competent trainings for providers. And we also are really trying to build up the housing options. I mentioned to Chair Lewis to avoid shelter. So the emergency housing voucher program, for example, that I mentioned, the Arab American Family Support Center did hundreds of applications for survivors, which is a voucher that then will allow you to leave the home and lease up a home. And we were able to run that successfully with housing search assistance for New Destiny and have people stably housed. I would say that's how we've been approaching it at the center, is really to provide that case management support and the housing options and support so that we can avoid shelter. And then obviously working with our provider community to ensure culturally competent and culturally specific training and partnerships with organizations.
That's very helpful. If you could provide any concrete data around exactly what is being done and how it's meeting the need or on the way to meet the need, because there's still very much a disconnect that it's unclear how to reconcile those things, because emergency beds are so difficult to find, particularly with this community for a range of reasons. So yeah, I'd love to see more concrete data and what funding is being made available to make sure that we are on our way to trying to address as much as possible.
Sure, I'd be happy to follow up with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Council Member. I have a couple of questions. Let me just move this up. This sound in this room is a little bit funky, so I apologize for that. Can you tell us, do clients who time out of the DV shelter get to go directly from DV shelter to the DHS shelter system, or do they have to return to PATH?
So clients that time out
Yes.
reach their maximum length of stay. We work, as they approach the maximum length of stay, the providers usually have a discussion with the client. And there is opportunity to either assist with placement in their Tier 2, family Tier 2 facility, or a safe placement at DHS, if there's no other alternative for the client.
So, wait.
So, and as I think we mentioned before, we are resuming our streamlining activities so that we can safely place clients, have them transition from our DV shelter system to DHS, so in a way where they can bypass the intake process and go directly to a DHS Tier 2 facility.
Okay, so, and that resumes how soon? I remember, how soon does it resume, the streamlining process?
We're hoping that it may resume by, before the end of calendar year 24.
Okay.
And Deputy Speaker, I would also add that one of the collaborations we work on with DHS is ensuring when a family or individual transfers from a DV shelter over to DHS, their eligibility for a rental assistance voucher, housing shopping letter goes with them. So if they were deemed eligible, when they get to DHS will generate a new shopping letter for them. So there's no need to do the entire reapplication process for them. So that's another mechanism for us to, streamline the process a little and make it less onerous for the transfer between DV shelters and DHS shelters.
Okay. And can you tell us, how is the administration serving new arrivals who experience domestic violence?
And do you mind just, I think I'm having trouble hearing everyone.
I
don't know if my hearing is bad today. I apologize.
We're all,
We're all muffled. Okay.
We're all struggling in this room
Okay,
today.
I think you said, how is the administration supporting survivors of domestic violence who are...
New arrivals, yes.
New arrivals, yes, okay. So I've actually, at NGBV, been working really closely with the operating agencies, operating the HERCs and the shelters, with my deputy mayor's office to provide best practices. So we've created a best practices document that we've distributed to all those sites, and we've done trainings for hundreds of workers at the HERCs and the shelters, and we're continuing those conversations and now going to do a new kind of series with DHS to ensure that folks know about the HRA non-residential programs, know about the family justice centers. We are seeing folks come into our family justice centers from those sites because of those trainings, and we just are going to continue to do that and ensure that there's competency and understanding and really addressing the specific needs that our new arrival clients are coming with, which is immigration consultations, right? We have immigration lawyers at our family justice centers, and we're able to connect them to those consultations. We're able to explore working with our colleagues at HRA transfers into the DV shelter system if the survivor wants to do that. So many folks are just not aware, right, of the options, and so we're working really hard to make sure that that knowledge is out there and those linkages are happening.
How does the time limit policy interfere with the way that we're processing those applicants?
So I'm going to defer to Rima to talk about, but we have had some direct connections into the DV shelter system, so I'll let Rima speak more about that.
Thank you, Jennifer. So we're talking, we're focusing on referrals from the FJCs to the DV shelters for migrants, yes. So access, again, to our DV system, really there's three avenues, and one of them is for migrants who are seeking shelter into our DV system would be making that connection through the Safe Horizon hotline. So we have been speaking to make sure, we've been making sure that messaging has been going out, right? So we want to make sure that migrants who are at risk of domestic violence, they are aware of that they have the ability to find accommodations in our DV shelter system. So we make sure that they have information for our non-residential providers that are in the community, should they not want to transfer or leave DHS or leave the community to go into DV shelter. So we've been working on just making sure that information is out there.
That information is being shared at the HERCs.
Yes.
Okay. So if a person is in a HERC, especially now that we have these 30, 60-day limits on time at these facilities, and an individual wants to try, that's in a HERC, qualifies and wants to transfer to a DHS DV emergency site, Are they also restricted by the 30 and 60-day rule? How does that impact their stay?
So no, so in our best practices document that we've developed and we've given to the HERCs, it says specifically that if there is a new arrival, a migrant in a DHS-run facility and they are experiencing domestic violence, they can be offered a linkage to the hotline. And I've emailed Rima late at night trying to get folks in because we want to make sure that people understand that's a different system and that system is available for migrants, and we've been able to connect people. I think it was just getting messaging out at the HERCs about that and making sure that people understood that that connection could be made.
Perfect, thank you.
And Deputy Speaker, just want to clarify, I think, if I heard you correctly, there is no difference in limitations for new arrivals from any other individual seeking our services. So there's no additional time limits placed on it. So they would be eligible for the 90 days and the 2 45-day extensions if granted by the provider for the emergency shelter.
Yeah, perfect, thank you. In 2018, Local Law 83 was enacted, amending Section 21-1411 of the Administrative Code of the City of New York in relation to exits from domestic violence emergency shelters. Local Law 83 requires New York City's Department of Social Services and Human Services Administration to submit an annual report to the Council Speaker, as well as to post the report on its website on or before March 1st annually. Does the agency make these reports available anywhere other than the reports, legal notices, and rules page of the department's website?
I believe, though, that's the only place where they were made available.
That's the only place where it will be available?
I believe so, but I could check and get back to you.
Do you know why the report has not been visible on HRA's website since 2021?
I will check and find out and get back to you.
Okay, and I would also want to know, why did the 2022 and 23 report not include data on EHVs?
Okay, so, yeah.
We could get back to you on that. We're, similarly to our colleagues at ENDGBV, we're very happy to report that HRA received 500 vouchers of emergency housing vouchers, specifically for survivors of domestic violence. And to date, I believe that 496 were placed in permanent housing. So we're very happy about that. And we're more than happy to include that because it's
brag about it.
Yeah, we should brag about it. And we're very happy about that success story.
That's how you brag. You put it out there. So, regarding today's preconsidered intro, which would amend the reporting requirements to increase its frequency from annually to monthly, as well as add reporting on domestic violence Tier 2 shelters, does the administration support these changes?
In regards to Intro 2572 and 2573, we agree with the intent to provide data and would like to continue a discussion with Council beyond this hearing with a view to amending the parameter of this proposed legislation in a manner that best aligns with our ongoing obligations to uphold clients' privacy and our capacity to produce this information, our capability to report in a timely manner, and our ability to ensure the accuracy of data to truly reflect the metrics and given report it aims to capture.
Okay. Regarding Local Law 79, how many domestic violence survivors applied for HRA DV shelter in August of 2024?
So, unlike DHS, clients seeking shelter, this is a request for the number of applications that were reported in August of 2024. Unlike DHS clients, clients seeking shelter interview directly with DV emergency providers. They are provided with several opportunities to speak with several shelters and have that discussion to see if the placement is okay, is appropriate for them. A provider may accept a client, may not accept a client. The client may accept placement, may not accept placements. Again, clients are given multiple opportunities to have that discussion with different providers. Therefore, it's kind of complex, very complex, to accurately report this data. The process of applying for a DV shelter is not a straightforward one-time application. There are several attempts assigned to a referral for a shelter. Our data team is unable to evaluate the linkage attempts in a way that would enable us to assign them to a single client at this time, but we are looking to see how we can provide this data to you in the near future. What we can do is report that there were, in August, 212 households admitted into shelter in August of 2024, and there were 34 singles that were admitted in that month of August of 2024.
Can you share the singles number again?
Sure, 34.
24, okay. 34 singles. Did you have a follow-up question? Did you have a question? Oh, okay. I felt her looking at me. So, understanding that you may not have all of the data, could you also include in the report back how many single adults applied for HRA DV shelter in August, and how many single survivors were able to enter HRA DV shelter in August? And how many single survivors were not able to enter the shelter, HRA DV shelter in August?
Right, so we are looking to work with our data team to see if we can produce that data for you.
Okay. Perfect. I think I had one more question regarding Project Home Pilot. So in April 2022, Mayor Adams announced Project Home Pilot in partnership with New Destiny Housing that would provide intensive specialized housing assistance to domestic violence survivors with children living in the city. 6 months on, what is the status of the implementation of this pilot, and are there any outcomes that can be reported at this time?
So thank you for that question. We recognize that domestic violence is a primary driver for homelessness in New York City, and we also recognize the need to provide safe housing for individuals who are experiencing domestic violence so that they can begin their healing journey and reintegrate back into the community. And so to that end, we did partner with New Destiny on the Project Home Pilot, which is intended to serve 100 families who are experiencing domestic violence, who have experienced domestic violence, and who qualify for city FEPS. We have both a treatment group and a treatment assistance, housing search assistance to determine if these interventions result in better referral process began in March of this year. We currently have an MOU through 2026, which also includes a evaluation period. So we don't have any data to share now, but we do anticipate being able to share data within a year or by 2026, whichever comes first.
Is within HRA's budget?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Is the new pilot program funding within HRA's budget? And if it is, under which unit of appropriation and which budget codes?
I'm sorry.
We can confirm this, but I believe it was private funded, and so I think that's why they're doing the research study as a pilot to see where it goes. I would say it really builds on the success we all saw through the EHV process of giving that dedicated housing search support, which is why we both feel we were so successful in helping survivors be placed into housing.
Okay, perfect. I have no further questions. Councilmember Lewis? No? All right. Thank you all so much for coming to testify. I now open the hearing for public. Open the hearing for public testimony. I remind members of the public that this is a government proceeding and that the quorum shall be observed at all times. As such, members of the public shall remain silent at all times. The witness table is reserved for people who wish to testify. No video recording or photography is allowed from the witness table. Further, members of the public may not present audio or video recording as testimony, but may submit transcripts as such recordings to the Sergeant of Arms for inclusion in the hearing record. If you wish to speak at today's hearing, please fill out an appearance card with the Sergeant of Arms and wait to be recognized. When recognized, you will have 2 minutes to speak on today's hearing topic, domestic violence and homelessness. If you have a written statement or additional written testimony that you wish to submit for the record, please provide a copy of that testimony to the Sergeant at Arms. You may also email written testimony to testimony@council.nyc.gov within 72 hours of this hearing. Audio and video recordings will not be accepted. We will now call the first panel. Stephanie Mansfield, Crystal Morrell, Daniris Espinal, and Stephanie Woodbine. Make sure to put the mic up close because we're having issues hearing, and the red light has to be on in order for us to be able to hear you. And any one of you can begin. You want to start from this side? You can begin. Yeah, just make sure your mic is on and put it a little closer to you. Thank you.
Hello. Hi. My name is Stephanie. Do you hear me now? Stephanie Mansfield. I am grateful to be able to be here and speak with you and just to give my perspective. I am 36 years old. I am a Haitian American immigrant, descendant, I should say. I'm a single mother of 3 beautiful children. Their father was my abuser. So in 2013, I was living with their father. The apartment that we were living in was under his name. The lease title was under his name. And this is where my story begins. According to HRA DSS website, they state how, domestic violence can include physical violence, forcible sex, threatening to hurt you or your children, constant insulting, stalking, obsessively checking up, or otherwise trying to control your behavior. I was unaware that I was in an abusive relationship. By the time I was aware, I was sexually assaulted by my abuser. I had my 3rd son, and it took 8 years of living in a home which I didn't feel like was my home. My abuser had access to my apartment. He was able to come in and out. And in the end, according to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, I was homeless. They have 4 staples of defining what homelessness is: literally homeless, imminent risk of homelessness, homelessness under federal stature, and fleeing or attempting to flee DV. 8 years of the 10 years I lived in that apartment, I was attempting to flee my abuser. I am a proud mama of a neurodivergent son. I am a proud mama of a son that has ADHD, that's on the spectrum. I am myself physically disabled. I suffer TBI. And these are all barriers that prevented me from fleeing my abuser. Not trying to be the best mom that I could be, prevented me from fleeing my abuser. The people that I encountered along the way prevented me from fleeing my abuser. There is multiple contexts of police officers or HRA workers or all of these agencies and organizations that were meant to uplift me as a survivor, and yet I was not supported. Last year, because of the EHV voucher, I'm a EHV voucher holder. This will be, the 10th will be 1 year that I am in my home that I feel safe in. 1 year. And last year, the incongruency where it's like everyone has their own definition of what domestic violence is and everyone has their own idea of what domestic violence is. And in the end, it made me and my children suffer. Housing is so important and is so vital. I need to feel safe where I'm going. I need to feel that my children will be safe, that they will be heard, that their tantrums is not tantrums, it's just learning disabilities. It's inputting the world differently. I did not feel safe. I was not safe until I moved. It is so important that the ACS workers, I had 3 ACS cases. I had 3 ACS cases against my abuser, and all of those encounters with so many people that could help, I still wasn't able to access the services that I needed. Microgrants are important. The ability to move and know that I'm gonna be safe, that my children are gonna be safe, and that we are not going to end up homeless again. The eviction notice, the eviction process, having the proper supports and people who are trauma-informed to help and aid. New Destiny Housing made an article in 2024 July, a crisis compounded on homelessness, DV, and DV survivors. They outline concrete steps that can change how we view homelessness, how we view domestic violence, and how to best support children that are, according to New York State, disabled, children that are undergoing the disability process, the IEPs, and the neuropsych evaluations. How do we speak up and stand out for those individuals? As a youth, I went into the shelter. I was with my mom. She was a domestic violence survivor. It was a one-off incident, and it was her determination to get us out of there that allowed us to be that 1% that was able to leave the domestic violence shelter. So for me as a mother of 3, and to place them in a situation where I knew routines are not a thing, that routines will not be able to be upheld, I put myself in risk in order to keep my children's sanity. And in the end, 3 ACS cases means that they were not safe. It means that they were harmed because of my decisions. But if I don't feel supported, how can I move forward? The 2 asks that I would like to emphasize is the improvement of data collection and reporting. How can you know what's going on with survivors if you don't have the adequate data to support it? Data allows change to happen. Data allows things to reveal itself. The second is recognizing the whole survivor, recognizing the things, the complexities that come with every single survivor, and the differences that make us beautiful, but the differences that makes it more complex. The access, the ability to see us. I will always prioritize my children before myself, and it led to my detriment. I was in the hospital a month after I was placed in new housing. I was not given access to the McKinney Vita, I think it is, where you get busing for your child when you're a survivor. I wasn't given that, and I spent Thanksgiving in the hospital instead of celebrating it with my children. But that's my disability. And if there were services, if there were enough services to provide me what I needed and my family and what they needed, I believe things will be different. I am so grateful of where I am now and where I am today compared to where I was a year ago. And I would like to thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Crystal Morrell, and as of August 7th of 2024, I have finally and legally defeated domestic violence. As you know, domestic violence is not always violent, and I've experienced many forms of abuse since I was a child before VAWA was enacted. On September 3rd, 2016, I packed what I had and I left along with my 8-month-old daughter. 90 miles outside of the city, all of my plans fell apart, but there was no turning back, because the last conversation I had with my abuser, I said, I would rather be homeless than to spend another night with you in this house. On September 17th, I made the decision to go to PATH. After hours of waiting, I was finally interviewed by a NOVA worker who then informed me that there may be a possibility that I would be sent back to Buffalo, sent back to my abuser, because if I had lack of proof of my abuse, aside from a copy of a police order where he threatened to blow my face off if I had him arrested after strangling me. Around 2 a.m. now, September 18th, we were placed in a homeless hotel in Queens. And we were told that a bus would come back to get us, to return us back to PATH. The bus never returned. So me being a New Yorker, because New York City is my home, I knew how to get back to PATH. But unfortunately, I had to start the intake process all over again. We weren't placed until Monday night in Safe Horizon's Willow House in the Bronx, although I wasn't DV eligible for another 10 days pending investigation. At Safe Horizon, I was further abused and traumatized by a system that was supposed to help me. I was denied the opportunity to apply for public assistance and was threatened with being discharged for doing so. From then on, I had to advocate for every single thing that I needed. With little notice of timing out, I was giving 6 days of knowing when we would be timed out. Again, I had to return to PATH to be placed in a DHS shelter. Upon arriving at the DHS shelter, I was informed there were no resources to help me. There was no food, there was no toiletries, there was no pantry. They couldn't even give me a Metro card. Again, I had to advocate for myself to get the bare minimum of what I needed to provide for myself and my child. Once my NYCHA priority had been upgraded to N1, after 3 months, 9 days before Christmas 2017, we were finally in our permanent home. Because I advocated for myself, I was able to start my own business in the DV shelter, as well as my advocacy for survivors, for victims, and for abusers alike with Sisters in Purple. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, committee chairs Ayala and Lewis, members of the City Council, and staff. My name is Daniris Espinal. I'm a mother and a survivor. Domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness, especially for women and children. Anyone can experience domestic violence. It doesn't discriminate on socioeconomic status, gender, cultural, or religion. Domestic violence is about coercive control, isolating, monitoring, restricting, and manipulating the victim's or survivor's reality. There is an interconnectedness between domestic violence and homelessness, based on New Destiny's report. The decision is to leave an abusive partner can be complicated by fears of homelessness and city shelters. In many cases, the survivor flees the situation with their children. It's a time of survival. In 2023, survivors were 5 more times likely to move to another shelter than to permanent housing. That year, 50% of survivors moved to another shelter, while only 9% found a permanent home. Emergency shelters only provided stabilized housing for up to 180 days. Without a safe place to rebuild their lives, survivors may be forced to remain in abusive situations, putting their lives at risk. Nationally, 1 in 5 homicide victims are killed by an intimate partner. The barriers for survivors to access supportive housing are the lack of safe and affordable apartments available, the length of time it takes to complete paperwork and inspections when renting with a subsidy, the length of time it takes to move into a supportive housing, set-aside units and/or lottery units, to name some. Stabilized housing is crucial for a survivor to heal and to regain control of their life. Providing access to shelters, but not importantly, a safe home, can be life-saving. I would like to remind decision makers that these are not just numbers that you're seeing. These are people like you and me. As a society, we have to cultivate the compassion and empathy towards the children. The children suffer greatly. Domestic violence is not a glamorous theme. However, we need to normalize having these conversations more often. Educate the public of the red flags and the dangers of domestic violence. How can neighbors or communities help? How can anyone help if they can't identify what is going on? As a survivor myself, I would say that housing is just the beginning to start healing. The survivor deserves to be heard and seen. These resources can help validate the survivor's experiences and help ease the stigma and shame. Thank you for having me today.
Do I have to press it? This thing keeps popping up. Good morning. Committee chairs Ayala and Lewis, members of the City Council and Council staff. Thank you for holding this oversight hearing on supporting survivors in NYC's shelter system, and for the opportunity to testify on behalf of DV survivors. My name is Stephanie Woodbine. I am a member of New Destiny's SVP, Survivor Voices Project, and co-chair of the Advisory Council at the Mayor's Office to End Gender-Based Violence. The lack of permanent housing solutions for survivors is compounded by the lack of affordable housing solutions across the city. New Destiny Housing is the only organization committed to ending the double trauma of gender-based violence and homelessness. I'm here today secure in my home now only because of the assistance I received through them. After years of housing instability, my family was evicted from our apartment post-COVID. For months, we stayed in friends' homes, hotels, and Airbnbs when I could afford it. We did not qualify for DV shelters, and I was afraid of entering the DHS ones. I received housing navigation services from New Destiny. This was a godsend, as I didn't have to go through too much re-traumatization where that was concerned. My navigator, acting as a liaison between me and potential landlords, cleared the way for me to maneuver homelessness, mentally and emotionally. I felt overwhelmed and ashamed that I had lost my home, even though much of this had to do with my mental trauma and financial insecurity due to vexatious litigation in family court and post-separation abuse from my former partner. I have done DV advocacy and outreach with the Voices Committee at the Mayor's Office to end gender-based violence, sharing information and supporting community events to prevent, recognize, and respond to everything from intimate partner violence to sex trafficking and elderly abuse. But when I joined New Destiny's SVP after I was rehoused last year, it was an opportunity to learn more about how things worked at the policy level and to further use my voice as a lived expert. Domestic violence, coercive control, and post-separation abuse are insidious. They're interwoven in all facets of society, at every social level and across every economic class. The effect of this is a pervasive and continuous rise in family homelessness, with women and children accounting for 57% of those trapped. When home is not safe, where does one go? A good home is a stabilizing factor in a survivor's journey. From surviving to thriving. I felt so humbled and grateful when I moved into our new home. I was able to focus on exiting survival mode and re-entering society as a contributor. More survivors and their families should be afforded the tools and the opportunity to thrive. This begins with them being stably housed and being able to parent responsibly. The city must work with the advocates to strengthen survivors' abilities to access housing and to sustain housing security while creating pathways to long-term stability and growth. A big step towards this is after they're housed, housing aftercare services. Just, a team to check in, make sure everything is going on. That goes a long way as well. This also means robustly funding microgrants, for example. The city should look into legalizing ADUs, like basements and cottages where vouchers can be used. Maybe provide landlord incentives to accept survivors with vouchers so they won't be shuttled around the various systems. I broke my foot when I was homeless. I broke my foot when I was homeless and traversing the city. It was a different kind of angst from that of my fellow survivors in the shelter system, but no less traumatizing. This computer. But no less traumatizing. I'm sorry. I'm trying to get to the rest of this and my computer, I want to slide down. Oh. Down. There. Down. Sorry about that. It should look into legalizing ADUs like basements and cottages where vouchers can be used, and maybe provide landlord incentive to accept survivors with vouchers so they won't be shuttled around the various systems. I broke my foot while I was homeless and traversing the city. It was a different kind of angst from that of my fellow survivors in the shelter system, but no less traumatizing, and a situation which would have been avoided had I been in my own domicile. A stable home, therefore, is also a safety factor for survivors. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. And we allowed you extra time because I wanted to be sensitive to your stories and wanted to make sure that you were able to express what you wanted to express. And I just want to say thank you. I think, when we talk about Domestic Violence Month and, the topics of conversation, they're very somber, right? But I also see a lot of resilience and a lot of power in this room, and you took your power back. Farah and I are colleagues in the City Council, and we're both survivors as well. And I think that it's a beautiful thing when we can take those tragedies and flip them and use them for, a greater good. I never think that people are watching this channel when they're watching, from home. You can actually watch. There's a channel where you can watch city council hearings, but you'd be surprised at how many women actually have stopped me in the street and have thanked me for sharing my story, which was hard to do. It's hard to share and be vulnerable and kind of, stand naked in a room when you feel judged and you don't want people feeling sorry for you. But it's important, I think, because it's greater than each of us as individuals. We're speaking for a whole entire community of women that haven't yet found their voices, and who your advocacy has the potential to help change. And so I thank you for that, because I know that it isn't easy, but you guys are kicking ass, and I don't know if that's a word that we can maybe scratch off the. But I said it and I stand by it. I'm really, really proud of you guys and excited to hear, all of the ideas that you're bringing to the table on ways that we could change the system so that they're better for the next generation. And hopefully we won't have, too many of those, and domestic violence is not something that we're seeing as prevalently in the near future. But in the meantime, it's important to continue to share our story and to advocate for those that haven't yet found their voice. Councilmember Lewis, did you have anything you wanted to say?
Deputy Speaker, I echo your sentiments, and I thank you for giving everyone extra time to share their story. And as the Deputy Speaker mentioned, you attending these hearings, having the conversations and advocating helps us to further advocate. As I was listening to all of you speak, I thought about your journey and getting FEPS vouchers and getting increases. It's really a tough fight, whether if you're on this side or on the other side. We all need each other in different ways, so continue to keep up the good work and stay in contact so we could further support one another. Thank you.
Thank you. We're now going to call our next panel, and be warned that there will be a clock. Kamiza Nizam Chatu, Shaniqua Ann Holiday, Gabriela Sandoval Requeña, and Chris Mann. You may begin. Again, if you could hold the mic as close to you as possible and make sure that the red light is on. Any one of you. Yeah.
Good afternoon, committee chairs Ayala and Lewis, members of the City Council, if there are any still, and the staff. Thank you so much for convening this hearing. I also want to thank the survivors who shared their testimony. It takes a lot of courage to come forward, and constantly inspired whenever I hear them speak. My name is Gabriela Sandoval Requena. I am the Director of Policy and Communications at New Destiny. New Destiny's mission is to end the double trauma of abuse and homelessness among domestic violence survivors. For 30 years, we've been solely dedicated to the solution of permanent housing for survivors. We are also a co-convener of the Family Homelessness Coalition and a member of the Supportive Housing Network of New York. Why do we do this work? Because domestic violence is a leading cause of homelessness in New York City, pushing thousands of individuals and children into shelter. However, with so little housing options available to survivors, they are more likely to move from shelter to shelter instead of housing. New Destiny recently released a report, A Crisis Compounded, which documents the struggles and barriers that domestic violence survivors face when trying to secure affordable housing after escaping an abusive relationship, and the long-term impact that they face as a result of the abuse. We will submit extended written testimony, so I'd like to use this time to highlight some of the key findings of the report. As I mentioned earlier, domestic violence is one of the main causes of homelessness. In 2023, nearly 11,000 adults and children went through the domestic violence shelter system, the largest in the country. And year after year, more families with children enter the separate DHS shelter system due to domestic violence than evictions. It is extremely difficult for single adults to enter the domestic violence shelter system, and I just want to flag that because that is usually LGBTQI members, community members, also people with disabilities and seniors. If I may continue, Chair, I'll be brief. Women of color are also impacted disproportionately. Most of the survivors in the DV shelter system are children, with children under the age of 8 being the largest age group, which is deeply concerning because we know of the intergenerational effects of abuse and homelessness. In 2023, more than 50% of survivors left HRA DV shelter for another shelter, and only 9% left for housing. Survivors who time out of HRA emergency domestic violence shelter without a secure placement must apply for DHS shelter at risk of being turned away. The abuse has devastating, long-lasting negative health impacts. Survivors are more likely to develop cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. More than half experience post-traumatic stress disorder and depression, and they can also sustain head trauma more likely than football players, but they're rarely diagnosed. Our report gives 13 recommendations within 4 overarching areas. I won't go through them here, but I'll just mention the 4 overarching areas that are to expand access to housing resources and services, ensure supportive housing is accessible and adequately funded, increase investment in microgrants and flexible funding, and improve data collection and reporting. We are grateful to DSS HRA for implementing some of these priority actions, such as amending the city supportive housing program to include survivors with children. Additionally, I'd like to thank the Council for considering legislation in this hearing to improve data collection and reporting on domestic violence shelter applications and exits. We look forward to continuing to work together to increase housing resources for New Yorkers impacted by domestic violence. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to testify before the committee today. My name is Shaniqua Ann Holliday, and I'm an Associate Vice President for DV Shelters at Safe Horizon, which is the nation's largest nonprofit victims assistance organization. We offer a client-centered, trauma-informed response to 250,000 New Yorkers each year who have experienced violence or abuse. We do this through a lens of racial equity and justice to guide our work with the clients, with each other, and in developing the public policy positions that we hold. We're grateful that the committees are looking at how to best support domestic violence survivors in New York City's shelter system. Safe Horizon operates 8 emergency and transitional domestic violence shelters that provide welcoming and supportive safe spaces with 741 beds. We also run the domestic violence hotline for the entire New York City, placing survivors in all DV shelters across the 5 boroughs. And our goal is to help survivors and their families get the resources they need to heal and thrive. We do this by offering a variety of services, including housing assistance, case management, on-site counseling through our new counseling services that we offer through our social workers, and then we have 1 to 2 housing specialists within each shelter to work with clients to solidify permanent housing. Just 2 areas I would like to highlight that are important to us right now are the Safe Shelter Act, and the recent developments within HRA's DV Shelters Division. So Safe Horizon helped to draft and then pass the state legislation known as the Safe Shelter Act, which will increase access to domestic violence shelters for single adult survivors. This legislation was sponsored by Assembly Member Andrew Havisi and State Senator Andrew Gonares, and it would provide the funding flexibility shelter providers desperately need to house many more single adult survivors of trafficking and domestic and gender-based violence. This flexibility would actually empower the sector and help ensure that all survivors, regardless of age, sexual orientation, gender identity, or family status, have equal access to life-saving temporary housing and support. The other area that I wanted to highlight, since for the sake of time, and I've submitted the written testimony to expand on the concepts, are the recent developments within HRA's DV shelter procedures. So in July 2023, they implemented an interactive voice response system and expanded on the use of this system to a significant number of DV shelters across New York City that they had been piloting in select shelters. The system allows clients to call in directly from designated phones at the DV location, sometimes in their units, within a certain window to submit their attendance in shelter for the day. And the system is proposed to simplify the attendance tracking process, reduce administrative burdens, and enhance the overall efficiency of services. Also, HRA has extended the time to submit attendance daily in the DV shelters to 2 p.m., and this addresses the varying needs of survivors in shelter, because of course we know that time constraints can impede on folks' ability to have their outside lives, right? The previous cutoff time was 10 a.m., and this allows the DV shelters to be more client-centered around the intersectionality of survivor presence in shelter and their daily living. And the last thing that I wanted to highlight is the most recent development is the discontinuation of the requirement to submit daily attendance sheets via email and e-fax to the billing liaisons for each shelter, and this helps us to reduce delays in attendance confirmations for the facilities, which improves utilization rates and increases productivity of billing submission and reconciliation. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, Chairs Ayala and Lewis. Thank you and the committee members for the opportunity to submit testimony today. My name is Chris Mann. I'm the Assistant Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at WIN, which is the city's largest provider of shelter and supportive services for families experiencing homelessness. We operate 16 shelters and about 500 units of permanent supportive housing throughout the 5 boroughs. Last night, 7,000 people called WIN home, including over 3,600 children. Domestic violence remains a leading cause of homelessness for families with children in New York City, surpassing evictions and overcrowding. In fiscal year 23, more than 20% of families with children entering DHS shelter cited domestic violence as the primary cause of their homelessness. At WIN, we see the impacts of domestic violence on families every day. 90% of the families we serve are headed by women, and many of them have fled abusive situations, seeking safety and stability for themselves and their children. Despite this immense need, we're facing significant gaps in housing options for survivors of domestic violence. The number of households leaving HRA domestic violence shelters for permanent housing has dropped by 18% between 2018 and 2023. Of the more than 2,000 survivor-led households who exited emergency shelter in 2023, 50% moved to another shelter rather than permanent housing. With such limited housing options, survivors are often forced into a cycle of shelter-to-shelter movement because of arbitrary shelter stay limits in the DV system. This instability is devastating for families seeking safety and a chance to rebuild their lives. This is why we support T2024-2572, which would expand reporting on exits from domestic violence shelters. WIN also supports 2573, which is aimed at helping to better understand demand for domestic violence shelters. We do have a couple questions about how to source that data. Additionally, we urge the Council to pass Resolution 363, introduced by Councilmember Gail Brewer, which calls on the state to pass legislation that would end harmful impacts of shelter limits and codify right to shelter in DHS, DV, and all shelter systems. Thank you.
Oh, hi, can you hear me? Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Kamiza Nizam Chatu, and I'm the Senior Deputy Director of Residential Services at Sanctuary for Families, New York State's largest provider of comprehensive services exclusively for gender violence survivors and their children. We are grateful for the opportunity to testify on the critical topic of supporting DV survivors in the city shelter system. Our special thanks to Councilmember Farah Lewis and Diana Ayala, chairs of the Committees on Women and Gender Equity and General Welfare, for calling this hearing and for this advocacy on behalf of marginalized gender violence survivors. We also thank Chair Ayala for introducing the 2 bills being discussed today, which Sanctuary strongly supports. Last year, Sanctuary provided confidential shelter and supportive services to 436 adults and children at our 5 shelters, 4 small crisis shelters, and Sarah Burke House, our 58 family Tier 2 shelter that was the state's first DV transitional shelter when it opened its doors in 1992. Like all residential service providers, Sanctuary makes every effort to maximize our shelter occupancy. But the city DV shelter system was designed for women with minor children fleeing abuse. As a result, single survivors, such as LGBTQIA+, trafficking older adults, are left out in the cold. The heads and beds per diem reimbursement model creates a serious financial dilemma for family shelter providers as they lose significant revenue every time they place single adults in units earmarked for families. We thank the City Council for its support of the Safe Shelter Act passed by the state legislature in June, which would ensure that OCFS provides full reimbursement to shelter providers when a room intended to accommodate 2 family members is used to house a single adult. Ultimately, we would like to see this to a 3-person units included into the policy. This reimbursement model poses other challenges for service providers. For instance, when residents must spend nights away from the shelter, such as when they're hospitalized or need to be out of town for valid reason, such as a family member passing. A short reimbursement is for hospitalization for 10 days, but if a client needs to go out of state for, say, someone passing away, or if they stay out of shelter, the agency is not reimbursed, which is very much unfair since we're still providing services. Another critical issue, if you just give me 2 more minutes, another critical issue is the state public assistance program, which are intended to provide financial help to abuse survivors as they work toward economic stability and independence. These benefits have not been raised for years, even decades. Currently, a single mother with 2 children in Manhattan receives a shelter allowance of just $400 per month. We support New Destiny's proposal to urge the state and the Assembly to pass A05543, which would increase the shelter allowance to 100% of the federal fair market rates and help to ensure that individuals can access safe and stable housing. We also support New Destiny's proposal to increase the basic needs allowance to keep pace with inflation. Lastly, it's no secret that the situation for shelter residents when they exit shelter is dire. We urge the council to strongly support the Housing Access Voucher Program proposed by the state legislator, which will create a permanent statewide Section 8-like rental program. The legislature should also be urged to help non-citizen New Yorkers by passing a bill expanding eligibility for city FEPS programs. There are 2 vital steps to expand equitable access to housing for domestic violence survivors, regardless of immigration status. We applaud the joint oversight efforts of the Women and Gender Equity and General Welfare Committees and are deeply grateful for your efforts to tackle these challenging issues surrounding affordable housing in our city. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today and for your unwavering commitment to abuse survivors. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to recognize that we've been joined by Councilmember Ressler, who has a few questions.
Thank you so much, Chairs Ayala and Lewis. Greatly appreciate your leadership and focus on this critically important issue. And thank you to each of you for your great work supporting survivors of domestic violence in New York City. Question, I think, probably for Wynn, but anyone to jump in. DV is one of the 2 primary drivers in our family system, right, for new entrants. Do we, in our DHS system, DV is one of the 2 primary drivers for families that enter the system. Do you think that as a city, we strike the right balance between having enough capacity in our DV shelter system and our DHS system in meeting the needs of survivors of domestic violence?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say no. I think, one of the struggles that we have is capacity in the DV system. It shows in the data. We have kind of a pipeline from DV shelter right into DHS shelter. So we're working with Assemblymember Cruz and Senator Hoylman Siegel on legislation at the state level that would create a right to shelter in DV shelter and eliminate time limits in those shelters. So,
and that was the next question I just wanted to ask is, because our DV shelter system is time limited, we often see families in need of having to enter into the DHS system. have we made any improvements as a city in trying to make that a seamless or improved referral process, or are we just sending people to PATH and hoping for the best?
I mean, I think Gabby can probably talk better about this, but I would say it's gotten worse.
Why?
Because now families have to go back to PATH rather than just being able to seamlessly transition into DHS.
Because if the family is in the DV shelter system, it's time limited. We know that on day certain they're going to have no place to go. Why would we send them through a complicated rigmarole to ensure that they have safe and stable housing? I don't know if
ask the same question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I second Chris. We asked the same question to the agency, and we heard earlier today during their HRA testimony that apparently they are looking into reinstating that rule. But it's devastating, it's re-traumatizing. Just the fact that you have to reapply for shelter, go through the whole process,
right.
It's just very, very, definition of unfair falls
Absolutely.
into that, yes.
And one of the things that I know our chairwoman has supported for a long time and that I strongly believe in as well, is the decentralization of PATH is critically important for families around the city. Why we would send families from Sunset Park or East New York or downtown Brooklyn to the South Bronx or Southeast Queens or wherever it may be, that every single one of those families has to go to the South Bronx doesn't make sense. And I, for one, would welcome a Brooklyn PATH center in downtown Brooklyn in District 33 because it's the most convenient place to get in Brooklyn. And so, I have made that very clear to DSS leadership for years and will continue to do so and help them identify space if that ever becomes an option. So thanks so much for the opportunity to ask a couple questions, and most of all, thank you for your hard work.
Thank you. Councilmember Lewis.
Thank you, Chair. This question is for Wynn. Local Law 45 that we passed earlier this year establishes a program to assist with door and window repairs and security for survivors of domestic and gender-based violence. I know we've had an ongoing security breach issue at Glenwood Wynn, so it'd be great to know if we could get the status of the locks to the gate, being that we do have survivors of domestic violence at this particular site in my district. And neighbors who are very upset that there aren't security measures at Glenwood Wynn in the district.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And certainly, we've been talking offline and happy to continue that conversation. If it's an issue that we've worked on addressing and continue to work on addressing. So if the last I heard, it sounded like that was mostly resolved, but if it's not, certainly let's talk offline and we'll make sure that gets resolved.
Yeah, I would appreciate it if we could keep talking about it because I know it's still an issue of security breach with that particular lock, but we just want to make sure that survivors feel safe at this location and within the district. So look forward to that conversation. Agreed. And a meeting with Christine Quinn.
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair.
I'll reach out to Daniel in your office to set it up.
Thank you. One of the things that I did want to ask was about the time restrictions, the 30, 60-day rules. So HRA testified that, DSS testified that does not apply in domestic violence shelters. Is that true?
So for crisis shelter, you're able to stay up to 3 months. After that, we put in for extensions, and you're able to stay up to 180 days. After that, if you did not get chosen for a tier 2 shelter, which is done through HRA, taking into consideration safe areas and household size, if you're not chosen for that, then it's unfortunately PATH. Or we speak to the clients if there's somewhere else that they could go. If it's family, because obviously we don't want to send our families back into the homeless shelter system, but unfortunately that's usually the only thing they have, because once you live in the community, you don't necessarily qualify for the housing vouchers. So basically the only options they have is going to PATH.
That's the rule for new migrant
crisis
families.
shelters, yes.
Yeah, okay.
For anyone
Asylum
residing
seekers.
in the crisis shelters.
Okay.
So my understanding is that the 30 and 60-day rule, because there's already the restrictions in DV shelters, wouldn't apply in DV shelters. Okay. And they only just started applying in DHS shelters, but have not actually rolled out yet.
Okay.
But we expect that they will soon.
All right, thank you. Thank you, guys. We will now call our next panel, which consists of Elijah Plan Frank, Stephanie Payer, Blair Dorlswater, I'm sorry if I'm messing up your name, and Teal Izunza. Here you go. Good morning. You can begin.
Good afternoon, I think now. Chair Ayala, Chair Lewis, and the rest of the City Council members that are here. My name is Teal Inzunza. I am the Associate Vice President of our Justice Initiatives Department at the Urban Resource Institute, the nation's largest provider of domestic violence shelter services. We serve over 2,000 people affected by domestic and intimate partner violence and homelessness. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the critical issues survivors face in accessing safe and affordable housing. The recent report from New Destiny Housing highlights several severe challenges survivors of domestic violence in New York City face, including immigration status, limited financial resources, and shortage of appropriate housing programs. These barriers not only jeopardize the safety of survivors, but also hinder their long-term stability. URI fully supports several key recommendations from this report. 1, expanding city FEPS eligibility. 2, creating statewide Section 8 like housing vouchers. 3, access to the shared program for Tier 2 shelters. 4, including survivors in the New York City 1515 supportive housing. 5, investing $6 million in NGBV's microgrant program. And lastly, reflecting the housing needs of single survivors, as we've heard many testify today. Each of these recommendations are essential, ensuring survivors can escape abusive situations and rebuild their lives. URI stands ready to support their implementation and continue advocating for policies that protect and uplift survivors. We will share more about these issues in our written testimony, and thank you for all of your leadership and on these urgent issues. We appreciate you.
Good morning. Thank you to the Committee on General Welfare and Women and Gender Equity for the opportunity to share my testimony. My name is Blair Dorschwelther. I'm the Director of Economic Empowerment at the Urban Resource Institute. Our program aims to provide economic justice through financial stability, meaningful employment, and financial healing. These are crucial tools to economic equity for survivors and their community. Every day we see the detrimental impact the public benefits cliff has on survivors' safety and security. A safety net that is aimed to support low-income New Yorkers acts as handcuffs to financial stability and independence. For instance, to qualify for FEPS-B housing voucher, survivors must earn nearly at or below 200% of the poverty level. City FEPS has comparable limitations. If a survivor's income slightly exceeds this threshold, they risk losing essential public benefits, including housing vouchers. Additionally, City FEPS is the only option for single survivors, but they need to have an open public assistance case. However, going to public benefits office, they rarely open a public benefits case without cash assistance. This puts singles in a catch-22. I once worked with a client who juggled 2 jobs to pay rent before she came to shelter. After entering shelter, her income surpassed the eligibility limit for public benefits, yet it wasn't enough to afford market-rate apartment. To qualify for cash assistance to secure FEPS-B vouchers for permanent housing, she had to quit one of her jobs. This scenario is not uncommon. Ironically, these programs require employment, yet survivors can't increase their hours, take additional jobs, advance their careers, or accept promotions without risking the loss of benefits, which ultimately leads to the loss of housing vouchers in their home. Many landlords are reluctant to accept vouchers, often distrusting the untimely payments from HRA. I once assisted a survivor whose landlord hadn't been paid by HRA for 11 months. In eviction cases, it's the tenant who is liable, not HRA. Survivors who are also burdened by economic abuse, and the average survivor carries $104,000 of debt in their lifetime. Many survivors face identity theft, fraud, and coercion perpetrated by the abusive party. They may not even realize this abuse until they are denied housing. On average, a survivor loses $1,280 a month to their abuser. This takes a physical and emotional toll for families. I'll just finish up. Without any of these changes, survivors are left paying for their abuse.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the New York City Council, the Committee on General Welfare, and the Committee on Women and Gender Equity for the opportunity to present this testimony. My name is Elijah Polvon-Frank, and I'm the Coordinator of Equity Initiatives at Urban Resource Institute's Economic Empowerment Program. URI's Economic Empowerment Program supports families impacted by domestic violence and homelessness on their journeys to achieve economic independence and growth. The EEP aims to achieve this goal through work readiness programming, survivor career counseling, and job development support. Financial empowerment for survivors of domestic violence is paramount to achieving safety for themselves and their families. More than 98% of survivors of domestic violence also experience financial abuse, presenting a barrier to their journeys of economic empowerment and independence. The EEP program focuses on equipping these survivors with support to re-enter the workforce and obtain employment that offers living wages. However, one of the main obstacles that survivors experience is the lack of and inaccessibility of childcare. This lack of childcare for survivors who are seeking employment often forces them to put their job opportunities and subsequent economic freedom on hold. While social services such as HRA and ACS offer childcare vouchers, these vouchers are often conditional on the fact that survivors can prove that they are employed and can take up to 30 days to process. I work with survivors who, after months of searching for employment, finally get a job offer, only to have to turn this offer down due to the fact that even if childcare is approved, they won't have the opportunity to place their children with a reliable provider by the time their job needs them to start working. Other times, survivors have had to ask family members to take care of their children because they could not afford childcare when they start working, with no guarantee that the childcare voucher will even be approved after 30 days. In some cases, they are approved and the survivor can continue working, only to lose their job later because the voucher expired or is terminated, reversing the efforts they've made to achieve financial stability and independence. Achieving employment and financial stability is the way that survivors achieve safety. They should not have to worry that they will be unable to accept a job because it takes too long for their childcare vouchers to be approved, and moreover maintain a job due to the fact that their childcare vouchers may be taken away for arbitrary reasons. Childcare should be the means for survivors to achieve safety, not the barrier. The EEP's goal is to support survivors on their journeys to financial empowerment and safety, but we currently have a wait list of over 100 people due to the lack of staffing positions available. The EEP is seeking funding to hire more staff to serve more survivors who are in need of our services. Further contributions would also give us the ability to provide for survivors who need childcare while they start their careers or search for employment. For survivors of domestic violence, financial empowerment is safety, employment is the key to financial stability, and survivors deserve safety above all else. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, Chair Ayala, Chair Lewis, and esteemed members of the City Council. My name is Stephanie Pear, and I'm the Program Manager for the Crime Victim Services at the Urban Resource Institute. Crime Victim Services provides crucial services to domestic violence survivors, including emotional support, advocacy, court accompaniments, and education on their legal rights. CVSP's goal is to help survivors navigate their journey to safety, healing, and stability. But one of the most persistent challenges they face is securing permanent housing. Housing remains the most critical need for domestic violence survivors, yet it is the most difficult to secure due to several barriers. One of the major challenges is that many landlords discriminate against survivors who use vouchers like FEPS-B, which is specifically designed to help survivors secure housing. Unfortunately, landlords frequently refuse to accept these vouchers, with some openly expressing their reluctance to rent to domestic violence survivors. I had a landlord state to me, "I do not want those kind of problems here." This type of discrimination prevents survivors from finding the stable housing they need to rebuild their lives. While some survivors do qualify for a FEPS-B voucher, others, especially those who are working but do not qualify for an HRA case, are left without any viable housing options while in emergency shelters. The clients are often forced to transition into DHS family shelters only to qualify for programs such as SODA, which is the Special One-Time Assistance Program that help clients pay for one entire year of rent. Expanding voucher programs like FEPS-B and SODA would greatly benefit survivors in achieving permanent housing and allow them to focus on healing. Another critical issue is the lack of consistent housing supports. The Emergency Housing Program, EHV, was offered to all domestic violence survivors in 2022, which proved to be a lifeline for many of our clients. During its implementation, I was able to assist 14 survivors in securing their vouchers and moving into permanent housing. However, the EHV program ended in 2023 and is no longer available to survivors, leaving many without a crucial resource. Reinstating programs like EHV would provide survivors with more opportunities to find safe and stable housing. URI remains committed to advocating for these essential changes, and we urge City Council to prioritize the housing needs of domestic violence survivors. Thank you for your time and attention to these critical issues, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
We don't have any questions, but I wanted to thank you for raising the issue on childcare, and we will be sure to include some follow-up questions to the administration on those. Thank you so much. Thank you. We will now call our following panel: Karina Lim Peralta, Laura Harris Rowe, Judith Goldener, and Rachel Canny. Karina, you're here, okay. Wait, hold on, I'm missing somebody, so I'm trying to figure out who. Laura? Judith? Judith Goldener? No? Okay, and Rachel, okay, gotcha, all right. You may begin. Your mic is not on. Make sure the red light is on and try to push it a little closer to you. You see the light on? I'm sorry. The red light?
Oh,
there, okay.
Sorry. Good afternoon, Deputy Speaker Ayala and Chair Lewis on the committee. Thank you for this opportunity today and for addressing this critical issue. My name is Karina Lim Peralta, and I'm a social work supervisor with the Center for Family Representation, Inc., CFR, in their Bronx practice. I work directly with parents facing ACS, neglect, and abuse prosecutions in Bronx Family Court. CFR is the countywide assigned indigent defense provider offering legal representation to parents with ACS cases in Queens, Manhattan, the Bronx, and Staten Island. CFR helps families prevent and navigate family policing investigations and works to reunite families who are separated by the foster system. Since our founding in 2002, we have represented more than 13,500 parents with more than 27,500 children. We take the lead of directly impacted families and seek a world where the family policing system is dismantled until it is abolished. We know that family safety and well-being can be achieved without surveillance, prosecution, or separation. Our clients who have survived domestic violence often experience staying in a shelter as another experience of coercion and surveillance that puts their families at risk of harm. When our clients and their children are forced to comply with arbitrary shelter policies, shelter staff who are mandated reporters often report them to the statewide central registry, the SCR, prompting a child protective investigation, or what we refer to as a family policing investigation by ACS. Family policing investigations are harmful themselves and can exacerbate feelings of fear and instability that many families who are fleeing domestic violence experience. The families that we work with have incredible resiliency and lean on their inner strength and courage, leaving dangerous situations in a state of crisis for safety and security, only to realize that these things are incredibly difficult to find within the city's shelter system. Shelters designated for domestic violence survivors do not guarantee safety, and survivors can also face re-traumatization within shelters. There is a lack of physical and emotional space and support. Survivors have shared that oftentimes shelter staff do not have conversations with them to better understand their family situation, and they are affected by judgment and gender stigmas. Ending mandated reporting and permitting shelter staff to first work with families to provide them with direct on-site support and resources before initiating a family policing investigation would protect CFR's clients from further harm. Many people do not know what happens after a call and report is made to the SCR, but we at CFR continue to see the long-lasting and generational effects of the family policing system. Thank you for hearing our testimony today.
Good afternoon. My name is Laura Horvath Roa, and I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a staff attorney with the New York City Anti-Violence Project, AVP. Thank you to the Committee on General Welfare and the Committee on Women and Gender Equality for holding this oversight hearing. AVP is the coordinator of the New York State LGBTQ Intimate Partner Violence Network, and along with colleagues from all over the state, we have produced a toolkit called Increasing Shelter Access to LGBTQ Survivors of Intimate Partner Violence. Today, I'll share some of the key recommendations from the publication, and you'll also find copies of the short guide with copies of my written testimony. The shelter access tool we have developed guides shelter staff through the basics of agency assessment, which includes key questions for evaluating the intake process, communicating inclusiveness to all clients, and screening that includes primary aggressor assessments. Inclusiveness is communicated at the level of staff language and signage throughout the space. However, it also includes access to gender-neutral spaces, especially bathrooms, which may also require education and accountability for all people using the space, not just LGBTQ survivors. We ask today that the needs of LGBTQ survivors be interwoven in all shelters and expanded safeguards and training developed to ensure the safety and dignity of the LGBTQ population. AVP has developed a framework for putting shelter access into practice. We also offer detailed self-guided assessment tools that shelters can use to get a picture of how accessible they are for LGBTQ people. We also offer LGBTQ cultural competency trainings to staff and volunteers at shelters and other service providers. Thank you so much for your time.
Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Kang, Director of Intervention Services at the Korean American Family Service Center, and I will be testifying today on behalf of KAFSC and The Collective, a coalition of gender-based violence organizations serving immigrant communities that also includes Saki for South Asian survivors, Sauti Yetu Center for African Women and Families, Violence Intervention Program, and Womankind. KAFSC is dedicated to empowering immigrant survivors of gender-based violence through comprehensive services. Last year alone, KAFSC provided safe housing and support to over 200 survivors, and we provide a 24-hour multilingual hotline. Last year, VIP also sheltered 117 adults and 147 children. While we commend the city for recognizing the ongoing needs for language access in shelters, the reality is that many GBV survivors are still struggling to obtain shelter and benefits due to language and cultural barriers. Some of the obstacles that immigrant survivors and our staff face includes inconsistent availability of interpreters and cultural sensitivity training for shelter staff, steep challenges in finding affordable housing after shelter, survivors who are ineligible for subsidies and benefits facing homelessness, and obtaining timely responses from city agencies during urgent situations, such as seeking immediate DV shelter placements. We urge the city to increase its funding for DV shelters that serve immigrant communities to improve both language access and cultural competency training. There have been positive changes seen at DV shelters as well, including the collaboration with health and hospitals, which has resulted in shelter residents being able to access mental health care for themselves and their children, and we encourage the expansion of this program. We appreciate Councilmember Ayala's efforts to increase awareness of how many and how often survivors are exiting shelter through the 2 new DV shelter reporting bills. Currently, DV shelter providers report to OCFS on denials and admissions, but not on exits. We recommend strengthening partnerships between city agencies and community-based organizations like the members of the collective to ensure that survivors receive timely, comprehensive support and are not left waiting for critical services. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
No questions at this time. Thank you so much. We will now call the following panel. Joan Diaz, Catherine Trapani, Barbara Manny, Haven Burhan. You may begin.
Thank you, Chair Ayala and Chair Lewis and members of the Committees on General Welfare and Women and Gender Equity. First, for holding today's hearing, my name is Juan Diaz. I'm a Policy Associate at Citizens Committee for Children, CCC, a multi-issue children's advocacy organization. CCC is a co-convener of the Family Homeless Coalition, FHC. The recently released report from New Destiny, A Crisis Compounded, highlights the intersection of poverty, gender, race, and how this impacts domestic violence survivors. And it tells us the impact. We were shocked to see that 23% of, last year, 23% of new population at DHS shelters, families with children, compared to 11% on housing eviction cases. We support Intro 2572 and 2573, which would improve data collection and efficiency in program delivery. However, we also support specific programs and initiatives that will improve the housing stability of domestic violence survivors, including this, to continue pushing for more set-asides at HPD homeless shelters, and also to increase funding for end gender violence grants at $6 million. Most importantly, we also encourage the city administration to include domestic violence survivors for city FEPS assistance, and especially to increase funding for home-based. Home-based providers are key in assisting domestic violence survivors once they exit shelter with aftercare services, and also when they're in the community and trying to flee abusers for transfers with city FEPS. So it is important with every increasing need to increase funding for home-based to address these issues. I'll provide more recommendations in a written testimony. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Sorry, I'm short. I'm going to try to move closer. Thank you so much. My name is Catherine Trapani. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Public Policy at Volunteers of America, Greater New York. We operate 6 emergency domestic violence shelters, 1 Tier 2 shelter, and several other facilities on the DHS side of the shop for families with children as well as single adults. Will submit written testimony with more details from our teams on the ground with things that we want the council to know, as well as comments on the legislation, but I want to just briefly use this time to touch on some things that have come up today. So the first thing, Chair Ayala, you had been asking questions about whether or not persons from HERCs or asylum seekers are subject to time limits on the DV side. They're not, so I am pleased to tell you that we operate three shelters for asylum seekers that will soon be subject to time limits, and we are proactively screening anyone there to see if they're survivors, to try to move them over to vacancies in our DV portfolio so that they can stay in the care of Volunteers of America and not have to have even shorter time frames. And we are encouraging all of our sort of partners out there to do that proactive DV screening so that if we can take them in, because we weirdly do have vacancies on the DV side, that'll be a more stable place. So I just wanted to assure you that we're attempting to make that happen because we're thinking along the same lines. The other thing that I think is unique to our shelter programs is that we try to offer enhanced services to survivors, particularly those that are impacted by traumatic brain injury or brain trauma. Around 2/3 of survivors that are in our shelters, we've done a first-in-the-nation screening protocol that has identified symptoms of traumatic brain injury. And we know that survivors very often have suffered injuries to the head or the neck that are consistent with brain trauma, but very often it goes undiagnosed and is mistaken for other behavioral health issues because the symptoms can really be very similar. So for example, feeling scattered, fatigued, anxious, those kinds of things, people will think that that's a mental health issue when in fact there might be a physical cause. And so we have really pioneered this model to do the proactive screening and then adjust our programmatic offerings like workforce development and other things to make accommodations for persons with TBI so that they can thrive and be successful when they transition into the community. And so Majority Leader Farias has a bill, Intro 29, that would expand that training on TBIs for first responders to DV so more people can do that. No, it's not the subject of today's hearing, but it feels very relevant because the long-term stability of survivors really depends on our ability to identify what their service needs are, both while they're in shelter and when they transition to housing. So I just wanted to make sure that we had a chance to kind of touch on that. But in my written testimony, you're going to find some recommendations on how to enhance services to survivors, both on the DV shelter side, which centers around some of the recommendations of my colleagues, such as eliminating arbitrary time limits by supporting the Cruz-Hoylman-Siegel bill up in Albany, implementing the DV SAFE Act to increase access to single survivors, which we've talked a lot about today. And then on the DHS side, just really owning and recognizing that those DHS shelters that even we operate are not equipped with the same survivor-centered care that you can get on the DV shelter. So really aligning and right-sizing the systems are super critical. And then expanding access to community-based DV services to accommodate persons that are transitioning out of shelter or who have been placed in a DHS shelter for lack of space so that people can have seamless access to care. A lot of the existing networks of FJCs and non-res providers that we heard about from the administration this morning are focused on persons in emergency situations. And so for things like aftercare or long-term stability services, it just doesn't feel like the right fit or accessible. So there's just a gap that we hope can get filled. So just want to thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you for your attention to data, near and dear to my heart. I ran the Statistics for Advocacy program at New Destiny for 9 years before my career changed. So appreciate you, have some notes in the written, and certainly look forward to keep working with both of you on these important issues. So thanks.
It's on now. Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairs Ayala and Lewis, and esteemed members of the Council. Thank you guys so much. My name is Heaven Berhane, and I actually serve as the project director of the RISE project at the Center for Justice Innovation. At RISE, we transform responses to intimate partner violence, focusing on the intersection for gun violence. And so what we've seen is that over the past few years, the instances of domestic violence, as we've heard today, homicides have been increasing. So we know that there have been 71 domestic violence homicides in New York in 2022, and up nearly 15% from the year before. So this is a very important issue, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation today. But in addition to that, the effects of domestic violence trickle down through generations, creating cycles of violence and trauma within marginalized communities. With over 40% of all families in the Department of Homeless Services having experienced DV, it is important that we expand services for this vulnerable community. Often people experiencing domestic violence, as we heard from different survivors here today and different agencies, have to leave their places they consider home for their safety and do not always have the means to afford places to live. This often results in immediate need to seek shelter. Many survivors that we work with report feeling unsafe in shelter, fleeing one dangerous situation from another. While they're in crisis, they're navigating the system, just to find themselves in another crisis, in another dangerous situations. Some survivors, as we heard today, do have past victimizations in shelters, which discourage them from leaving their current situation. And then further, the scarcity of beds and need for victims to transition to store their belongings in domestic violence shelters intensifies the challenges that survivors and their children encounter when seeking refuge. Recently, the RISE Project, we worked with a client who was forced to leave her partner related to a DV situation. And while she was navigating, we were supporting her with Sisters in Purple, another DV organization. We came across the challenge of she couldn't be able to bring her stuff. And for her, that was an important thing, right? To be able to have your stuff when you're leaving a situation, you want to feel a sense of safety, a sense of normalcy. And so what we did as a RISE Project is we supported her with safety planning, transportation, and we identified storage that we could pay for her stuff so that she could feel a sense of stability and safety as she went into the shelter system. But these are things that we don't want to have people to navigate through when they're going through the shelter system. You don't want to have to be thinking about these things. You want to find safety, and in finding them safety, it helps to ensure that people, lives are saved, right? And that we don't lose lives, because we know that if they have to go back to their homes, right, and there's a gun in the home, it's 5 times more likely that this woman, particularly women and Black women, will be killed. So I thank you so much for you guys for having us be here today to testify and speak on behalf of this very vulnerable population.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Barbara Menu, and I'm 56 years old. I have 2 disabled sons. I'm here because of some agencies' misconduct and also abuse on us. My 2 sons and I have become homeless since June 2018. First, we had a Section 8 voucher. I had this Section 8 voucher for almost 20 years with my other 2 older sons. 2017, the apartment that we were living were unlivable. So the city told us to go to shelter. So we moved our things to the storage. And then the city moved us, placed us in a shelter in Queens. At that time, my youngest son, who is here with me, was 12 years old. And he hasn't been to school since 12 years. That was 13 years. Since 13 years, when he turned 13. So when we were in shelter, the shelter told me to look for housing because after 6 months, our Section 8 can expired. So I began looking for apartment. So after 2 months, I found an apartment here on Flatbush. And the lease, we had 1-year lease. So May 2018, the lease expired May 2018. The management didn't renew the voucher. So I decided to move my children out of the city. In the meantime, after they didn't renew the voucher, I decided to seek shelter from DHS. DHS refused to place us in shelter, so I decided to move my children to Albany. In Albany, they gave us 1 month to stay in a shelter. After 1 month, they told us to move out. So we came back to the city, same year, June 2018, to see if the DHS will place us in a shelter. Again, DHS refused us shelter, saying that we don't qualify. Why? Because my children's addresses were switched. In other words, they were changed by HRA. So every time you go to a shelter, even though my children are with me, the DHS system says my children are not with me. They are living in different places. So it became a problem. So I decided to move from the States with my children. First, we went to Canada. We went to Washington, D.C. to see other states, to seek shelter. There they refused, they denied us. So I have a sister in Canada. My sister decided to let us come and move in with her. So I used to be on disability after I had my son. And then, so that income was the one that was helping us to rent places, rent motels. So after Canada, we went to California to see if we can get shelter there. The first shelter was Oceanside. We were given 1 month. Every shelter, 3 shelters, we were given 1 month to stay. So the last shelter was San Diego, Salvation Army. There then I decided to look for apartment. So we found apartment in Oceanside. There, the lease, in the meantime, before I moved to out of the state of New York, I requested the voucher to be put out to California, which was never did. So, which was never transferred. So in California, I was looking forward for the voucher to come, but it never was transferred. So in the shelter, they told me to look for a place, otherwise they're going to throw us out on the street. So I decided to use at that time, all of us were receiving Social Security disability. So when I found the apartment, it was very expensive. So I have to use all the disability money to pay the rent. And then also go for food pantries. That was what we were dependent on in Oceanside. So 4 months later, the owner said money became a problem. We couldn't afford it. So the owner evicted us. So I decided to come back with my children to Virginia to see if I can find, I'm from Ghana. I decided to come to Virginia to see if I can find people from my country. So there I met somebody from my country in Reagan Airport. And this person allowed us to move in with him from August 2019 to 2021.
Okay,
when he lost the house,
we're gonna need
the
you
owner decided to sell the house.
Can you?
Sure. So what I'm trying to say is, because of this corruption, my son have no education from 13 years old. And even when he came back to the city to seek shelter from last year, same thing. The first shelter here in Brooklyn, we stayed there for 9 months with no housing assistant, with also my children's Social Security money have been claimed because we're homeless. Social Security didn't know where we was. Therefore, it was paid by third parties who said my children are being cared by. Right now, currently, we've been shipped to 4 shelters from February to October. We have no money to eat. And also, my son, who the oldest one, has type 2 diabetes. The shelter currently that we are in now, before this shelter, we were in Bronx. I was arrested for trespassing. That they told us we are not eligible to stay there. So they called DHS police to arrest me for more than 6 hours. While my disabled son, who is also type 2 and severely mentally disabled, hungry with no medication. Finally, they let me go and said that they are not going to press charges. So we have to come back to PATH. PATH also continues saying that I have to provide for the past 2 years, which I have all the documents here, for the past 2 years where we have been. Otherwise, they are not going to place us in shelters.
Yeah, I think that I appreciate your testimony. I think that this warrants maybe a further offline discussion. Maybe we can have the staff get your information so that we could figure out how to be helpful. But thank you for sharing your experience.
Can I share this? Because the Section 8, currently we don't have the Section 8. It has been given or sold to somebody else. I requested it 2019 when I came back to New York to ask for the Section 8, why it wasn't transferred to California. So please, I need your help with the Section 8. And
one of the staffers will collect your information and then we'll figure out how to be helpful.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Ma'am.
Thank you to
so
this
much.
panel. We will now be moving to our final panel, which would be a Zoom panel. So we're going to be calling up Charlena Powell, Canals, Shani Ades, Debbie Dana Stork, I'm so sorry if I'm like completely botching your name. Danielle Emery and Stephen De Castro. We're gonna unmute Charlena first.
Hi, good afternoon. Please bear with me.
You may begin.
You may begin, Charlena.
Okay, I'm just sound check to see if you can hear me.
Yes.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to provide a testimony online. The title of my testimony is called DV Shelter Exit Planning from the Lens of an Unaccompanied or Single Person Household Survivor and Subject Matter Expert. I'm happy to be responding to T2024-2572 as well as T2024-2573. Hello, my name is Charlena Powell, and as I said, I identify, and that's really important in the identification as a person with lived experience and subject matter expert on the intersection of domestic violence and homelessness. I've also been an advocate for social justice and equitable systems practices throughout New York City and in other cities across the United States. So I wanted to first start off with why I'm writing this testimony. The City Council writes and passes local laws that affect day-to-day lives of people living in, working in, or visiting New York City. One of the things I'm very passionate about is amplifying the voices of survivors of domestic and gender-based violence, people like myself, and that's been a core driver in my professional career design and throughout my household lifetime among my nuclear and extended family composition. Often limited and in need of greater investment, many considered to be a vulnerable population of domestic violence, including communities of unaccompanied women, communities experiencing unsheltered homelessness.
Thank you. Your time expired.
I'm sorry?
Your time expired.
Can you wrap?
Sure.
Thank you.
And also, if it helps, then I can submit my testimony written if you'd like to move to the next.
That would be perfect.
Thank you very much
for
this opportunity.
Okay, we're going to unmute Janelle Canals.
You may begin.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you about supporting families in New York City shelter system who are survivors of domestic violence. My name is Janelle Canals, and I am the director of the Robin Hood Project at Advocates for Children of New York. To fully support survivors of domestic violence in the shelter systems, families need their children to be able to attend school and feel safe in their school communities. However, through our work with Sanctuary for Families and Safe Horizon, we have seen survivors in the shelter system face many barriers to accessing educational services for their children based on their housing status, their need for confidentiality, and the need for more school-based supports. Students in shelters in grades K through 6 are entitled to busing so that they don't have to transfer schools when placed in shelter. However, unlike students in DHS shelters, students in domestic violence shelters are not automatically provided with busing, and there is often confusion about the responsibilities of school staff members and domestic violence shelter providers in arranging transportation and entering the confidential PO box location needed for bus routing. This confusion often leads to delays, school absences, and ultimately unnecessary school transfers due to lack of timely transportation. Such confusion can also compromise the safety of families and their confidentiality. Just last week, a school requested a confidential location from a shelter and a family, even though the confidential address was not needed in order to provide busing. To better support survivors and their families, the city should encourage New York City Public Schools to implement the recommendations of the Students in Temporary Housing Transportation Task Force, including creating a protocol that clearly defines the roles and responsibilities of New York City Public Schools staff and shelter staff. We have also had cases where New York City Public School staff has failed to update a student's profile to limit communication and contact with a potentially dangerous person, despite families providing documentation of domestic violence and requesting notice prior to any disclosure of information.
Thank you. Your time expired.
To close, we would encourage the city to recognize that supporting survivors in domestic violence in the shelter system also means ensuring that New York City public schools are prepared to support these families and have the systems in place in order to make sure children can attend school safely. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now unmute Shani Adis.
You may begin.
Chair, council members, and staff, thank you for the opportunity to testify. My name is Shani Ades. I'm one of the vice presidents at New York Legal Assistance Group. I previously spent my entire career providing services to survivors of domestic violence. We believe that one of the things most central to survivor services is our role in expanding options for survivors. Years of isolation and coercion take or attempt to take power away from a person. Our services should aim to give that power back. To do this, we need resources, including shelters that are responsive to the needs of survivors and their families by being accessible, inclusive, and trauma-informed, and that survivors across shelters have uniform and transparent rules and procedures so they understand their rights and responsibilities. We do not have enough beds and spaces for domestic violence survivors in New York City right now. We need more. We also need more spaces that aren't solely able to support cisgender female survivors with young children. Similarly, survivors who have religious and dietary restrictions are most often not accommodated by the DV shelter system. Survivors who are calling our hotline being told that their city's hotline being told there are no beds available or none that fit their family needs limits the safety planning options a survivor may have when our goal needs to be to expand it. I've also had clients weigh accessing shelter due to not only the initial uprooting of themselves and their kids to move there, but also the ongoing risk of instability through constant shelter moves due to the time limits. There's not enough affordable housing in New York City. Survivors, especially those who are low income, who might have experienced financial abuse, or who are relying on our protracted systems like our courts to obtain support or access to assets, need time. If entering our shelter 100 days in, they yet again have to change schools, jobs, find new resources for services, whether counseling or a child's special education or medical needs, there's a chilling effect to be able to enter the shelter system. In addition, we know that the lack of transparency and uniformity on shelter rules is a huge problem. This means limited access to reasonable accommodations, which aren't determined by a centralized source, but set shelter to shelter. We also strongly believe that shelters should be mandated to provide and publicly post shelter rules in residents' preferred languages, as people who may be complying with court orders for visits in the evening are not able to return without risking expulsion. Thank you so much. We'll expand on this in our written testimony, and thank you for calling this hearing today.
Thank you. We will now call Debbie Donestorg.
You may begin.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Ayala and Chair Luis. My name is Debbie Donestorg, and I'm the Program Director to Safe Homes Project, a community-based domestic violence program under Good Shepherd Services. We operate, our location is in Park Slope, Brooklyn, and we also have staffing at the Brooklyn Family Justice Center. I guess I want to hit on a couple of points. The Safe Homes program works closely with the Family Justice Center in Brooklyn, receiving anywhere between 5 and 6 referrals daily. And our referrals come from all over, including DV and homeless shelters. And some of the challenges that we're seeing the families that we're seeing are experiencing is obviously a lack of affordable housing, access to translation and language services, access to childcare, so families can follow up with their appointments and seek employment. There's very limited access to immigration information and legal support. There's busing concerns when families are in shelter. And also one of the very important parts of this also challenge is that there's lack of trauma-informed support for shelter staff. Staff in shelters need to be trained in trauma-informed care to best support their work, considering that often, staff are credible messengers and survivors dealing with vicarious trauma. And this is really critical. and it's critical to invest in programs and support for the shelters that are supporting domestic violence survivors and their families in New York City system, as well as programs such as Safe Homes Project, which is extending that support to outside shelter, outside of the shelter system itself. And I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify. And if there's any questions, I will also submit our testimony.
Thank you. We will now unmute Danielle Emery.
You may begin.
Good afternoon, council members. My name is Danielle Emery. I am the director of the People and Animals Living Safely, or PALS program at Urban Resource Institute. PALS welcomes survivors of domestic violence into 10 of URI's 15 DV shelters, serving more than 100 heads of households and close to 150 animals per year. URI was the first shelter provider in New York City to welcome pets into our facilities, and 11 years later, we are among a handful of organizations that provide this service. Multiple studies have shown that 50% of survivors state they will not leave an abusive situation if they cannot bring their pets with them. Survivors and those facing all types of crises, including natural disasters, see their pets as family members. People will not access shelter, evacuate, or seek safety if it means separating from their pets. Shelter needs to be accessible to survivors and their entire families, animals included. Many survivors choose to obtain emotional support animal documentation to access shelter and stay together with their pets through protection provided by the Fair Housing Act. They must then fill out paperwork and wait 10 to 14 days for a DHS determination as to whether their ESA will be allowed into shelter. This wait is more frequently closer to 1 month. This is not a reasonable amount of time to ask a person in crisis to make alternate care arrangements for a beloved family member. All shelters should be accommodating of pets to reduce barriers to safety and increase access to shelter. New York City is also not doing enough to help single survivors of domestic violence with pets. This is by far the largest group we hear from among the nearly 500 people who contact us each year seeking shelter with their animals. If singles are able to access DV shelter, their time in that system is tightly monitored, and the vast majority are not able to find permanent housing before being discharged. The expectation is that these clients will go to DHS's single assessment centers, but this is not an option for those with pets, or even with approved ESAs. Most singles we assist through the PALS program end up returning to their abusers or other unsafe situations. The New York City shelter system creates significant barriers for people whose pets may be one of the few sources of love during their toughest times. We will submit some recommendations with our written testimony, and I thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you. Our final panelist, I don't see him online, but we will call him anyway. And Stephen DeCastro.
You may begin.
Stephen DeCastro. Okay, it doesn't appear as though he's online at this moment. So with that, we have now heard from everyone who has signed up to testify. If we have inadvertently missed anyone who would like to testify in person, please visit the sergeant's table and complete an appearance card now. We are making a final call for Zoom registrants who have not yet spoken. Okay. If we inadvertently missed anyone who would like to testify virtually, please use the raise hand function in Zoom, and I will call on you in the order the hands were raised. Seeing no one else, I would like to note that written testimony, which will be reviewed in full by committee staff, may be submitted to the record for up to 72 hours after the close of this hearing by email. You can email it to testimony@council.nyc.gov. And with that, this hearing is concluded. Thank you all.